I could not believe what I was seeing. I could have filled the back of his head with 5.56, which is an absolute joke.
Well, it's not an ape, because if the Sasquatch was an ape, we would already have one.
What are these elusive hominids that stalk the wilderness? Your host, two-time witness and field researcher for more than 40 years, William Jevning. Welcome to the mystery. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Creek Devil. We have a special guest today, Philip. Philip, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Glad to be here. How are y'all?
Very good. We were just chatting before we started recording. Really interesting stuff so far. I didn't want to wait too long. So, Tom, you've talked to Philip, haven't you, earlier?
Yeah, well, we chatted. This is the first time we've spoken.
Okay.
Over the phone. But yeah, no, we communicated on email. And Philip, you did a write-up and compliments on the write-up that you did. A lot of them that we end up with are and that's fine. A lot of them are just kind of run-on sentences and no punctuation, and yours is really segmented very well.
Well, listen, Philip.
Well, I appreciate it. I did go back and read it, and there were a few spell problems and stuff. I should have edited it a little better.
The bottom line is your encounter, just the one, and you said there's others, but the one that you sent me was very interesting, and I would love it if you could start off with that one.
Before he does, I have something I'd like to do first, before we forget. Philip, you were just telling us about some of the history that you looked into. Tell us about, let's go through that again, and tell us about what you dug up from one of those really early accounts from Georgia.
Okay, so I was looking up Bigfoot sightings from that area. First, I found one that's much more recent that occurs on Highway 1, which goes into Fargo, Georgia. And Fargo is the entrance into the southwestern side of the swamp. Once you hit Fargo, you got to go up 17 miles into the swamp to get to the registration area for camping. And I'd found a sighting where a husband and wife were driving down that road going back to Florida in the middle of the night, and they found this thing hunched over the side of the road, appearing to, what he said, looked like it was eating some kind of roadkill. And it stood up and just watched them. And, the typical description, over 7 feet tall, kind of a domed head, but, they were freaked out and they just kept driving. But as I'm looking up these stories about, because the Okefenokee is the perfect environment, for these beings to live, and I came across this, I think it's it might be a Georgia website that relates to state and national parks, and they got a whole history about, lore in whether it's ghosts or UFOs or Bigfoot. And I came across this story, and I wish I knew the exact date, but this was really way back, like when some of the first settlers probably would have moved into that area, because the place had already had tons of Native Americans living in there, making their living there. But there supposedly were some people were deep into the swamp. I don't know what their business was in there, if they were going back there hunting, but they came across some massive foot tracks. And they came running back eventually towards wherever their encampment was, probably much further on the western end, and said, there's something huge back there with human-like footprints. And so a posse went out with guns and everything. And if you look at the topography, if you looked at it, they would have had to have somehow taken a boat or something with them so that they could, maybe something like a log canoe that they could drag when they needed to and also put it back in the water. But that's just speculation on my part. The point is that it is stated they went into one of the deepest parts of the swamp, and they actually encountered a being, and which they described as just incredibly huge. Like, I thought, well, sometimes in the heat of something you might exaggerate, but I can expound on that later because I don't necessarily agree with that. But they claimed this thing was like 12 feet tall, and came at them and ended up killing some of them before it had taken enough bullets to actually bring it down. And then the report was the thing was just way too massive and possibly think about dragging it back. We're talking, I don't know how many miles back to where they had come from. But the interesting thing is, so when perusing Google Maps on Okefenokee Swamp in 2020, in one of the deepest parts of the swamp, I came across an island called Bugaboo Island. Now, I tried to do some research on when that island would have taken on that name, and I didn't really get too far with that. But Bugaboo is just like booger and wood booger and boogeyman and all those southern colloquialisms that we have for these things down here, you know. So I thought just thought it was an interesting coincidence because it's deep in the swamp and it's called Bugaboo Island. So anyway, that's pretty much the gist of that. And once it struck me, I was like, wow, I should look more into that. But I haven't found any more about like where the name originated from on that island.
Hey, Philip, we're going to move in pretty quick to the to your encounters, and I think you've had more than one. But real quick, can you give us a without being too specific, how far is this Bugaboo Island from the one that you and I were just talking about? Your encounter.
Okay. So the main off of Billy's Lake, when it moved, because it kind of moves generally west to east, and when you get towards the eastern side, it kind of dead ends at a place called Billy's Island, and that's one of the most famous islands in there because there used to be a logging company there called the Helford Logging Company or something like that. I can't remember the name. When you go on that island, you can still see a few remnants of it, like, old ancient car chassis and railroad tracks. But the island has eaten all that up. But I've had some weird sounds, too, when we were out just traipsing around Billy's Island. So Bugaboo Island, at a guess, is probably 2 or 3 miles south of Billy's Island, but that's a total guess without looking at Google Maps. And where this encounter occurred for me was just literally probably a few hundred yards north of Billy's Island in that tributary that leads up to Minnie's Lake. So if you saw, when you were looking on Google, if you saw that tributary where it turns off north that heads up to Minnie's Lake, this, in my memory, this occurred pretty close to Billy's Lake on that tributary, not way up in there. It was on the way back down going to Billy's Lake that this occurred. Now, I have to stress, my study of memory is that our brains are constantly re-editing things as time goes by. And so I do have to stress, I'm sure there's flaws in my recounting of what happened, except for some of the crucial parts which just indelibly imprint themselves, you know what I mean? But I'm kind of guessing as to where. So when I was going to send you that picture with the pin on where I think it roughly happened, the pin was on the wrong side of the river. I pinned it on the east side of the river, and what occurred is as we're coming back south towards Billy's Lake, all this commotion occurred on our right, which would be on the west side of the river.
West side,
Yeah, where it's really thick. So when I talk about thick, I'm talking about cypress knees. I'm talking about all of the kind of tangle and bush before it gets deep into the forest. So it's even, and a lot of the stuff comes out into the water. And you're talking about total blackwater swamp, like you're talking about, like Creature from the Black Lagoon. This is complete blackwater swamp here. And so a lot of the thicket comes out into the water, and I heard all this commotion going on, and so did Bob. We immediately looked because this was clearly not a raccoon but we couldn't see anything. But I started seeing some of that thicket moving around. And I'm like, okay, gosh, that's probably it's either an alligator kind of hung up in that thicket trying to get out, or it's a deer. The main 4 possibilities were alligator, deer, hog, or a black bear, because there are a ton of hogs and black bear up in the Okefenokee. Too big a sound for anything else, whether it was a fox or anything else I don't even think foxes are probably getting traipsing in the water like that. And then it just kind of occurred. This human form, roughly human form, stood up as it literally was already turning away from us as it went to stand up. Like, my feeling was, when I thought about it later, is we actually, because we were in a canoe, we're being so silent. This is one of those moments where they actually get caught off guard. I don't know if it was looking for fish or cleaning its hands, or I have no clue about that. Getting water. But it was like, oh, these guys are disturbing me. Let me get out of here. And the thing about it was, though, is I could see pretty much most of its torso. I got a kind of a glimpse of the head as it turned, but not well, so I can't really give it too good of a, because it was all so fast. But it clearly had the head resting on, I think I described to you, Tom, that I'm sure they have some kind of a neck, but are you there?
Yeah,
y'all there? Okay, there was a little noise on the phone or something.
Yeah, we're here.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, so I'm sure they have a neck, but the neck is so planted down at these massive shoulder muscles, like I described to you, like a bodybuilder who spent way too much time on shoulder day. You know what I mean? That it's surrounded by the neck muscles come almost up to like the ear level, you know? And it had that dome shape. The best description I can give you of what I remember seeing, if y'all ever seen that photo, it may be a hoax, and it probably is, but it's a good photo. It's supposed to be a trail cam photo that Melissa Hovey took credit for. It shows this clear close-up backside image of what's supposed to be a Bigfoot. You can see the hair, but you can see through the hair, and you can see things that look like ticks or bumps on its back. Have y'all ever seen that photo?
Oh, okay. I've seen the photo. I didn't know who it was attributed to. Yeah.
Well, Melissa Hovey didn't take credit for taking it. Somebody sent it to her, and it's supposedly from a trail cam in Georgia. I've often heard it's supposedly a clever hoax, and if it is, that's one of the best still frame hoaxes I've ever seen. But anyway, that's the description.
I'm going to comment real quick on that, and then I'll let you continue on. But, the people that say it's a hoax, or a lot of the so-called community out there, I wonder what kind of experience they have and background they have to say yay or nay it's a hoax. So,
well, here's the issue.
It probably is a hoax.
Here's the issue. You would have to back up to the game cam for the picture to be taken.
Yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying. Unless there were one of those ones like the plot watchers or whatever that just take photos at a designated certain amount of intervals. But you're right. I mean, it's probably, I hate to say that. A lot of people, of course, the rock and the hard place with Bigfoot images, you're either damned if you do, damned if you don't. If it's too clear and too realistic of a looking image, it's got to be a hoax. If it's too blurry, then it's clearly a hoax. But anyway, I was just referencing that if y'all familiar with that image, the overall, I looked at, when I saw, it came across as like what I would think of like as some kind of prehistoric looking man, It wasn't, it clearly was more, it was different than just simply being an upright gorilla that walked, because the proportions were different. And I think we all know about Patty, where her proportions fit somewhere in the middle between humans and other primates. The musculature was so defined on the shoulders and the arms. Like, and this thing wasn't some 8-foot beast, but it was still massive. Like it was. And I was 40, I'm guessing I was 40 feet away in the river in a canoe. So once again, with memory and all that, but and since not being able to see the legs and where they went down, I'm guessing 6 to 6.5 feet tall. But what was the craziest about the whole thing is how much commotion it was making as we approached the area. And then once it stood up and started walking back into the forest, yes, of course the sound is going to fade, but it seemed to fade so unnaturally quick. Like, it just started going silent so fast that I was like, that's bizarre. This thing was making a massive corruption, and now somehow it's going into that forest almost like a ninja, And I do often refer to these things to other people when they ask these questions. How can this be and how can that? I'm like, you're looking at what is basically a forest ninja, a massive forest ninja. I get it. But cat-like stealth and speed, in my estimation anyway. And obviously it's imperative they keep tabs on us, and would always be doing so wherever they are. So that was that. So can I back up a bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
My interest in the subject came about in 1975. My parents took me and my twin brother to a movie called The Great Waldo Pepper, which was starring Robert Redford about like a World War I fighter pilot or something who never got his chance in battle or something like that. It's been a long time, but later I reinvestigated all that to kind of lock in the time frame. So I would have been 9 years old. And back then they did shorts. You know, they did these shorts before me. They didn't necessarily just bombard you with 30 minutes of trailers. You had Mr. Magoo cartoons and this and that. And they did like a 15 to 20-minute short on Sasquatch. And it included the Patterson film. And it included recordings, of course, like howls and all that kind of stuff. I don't recall any recordings like the Sierra Nevada sounds, but I recall some pretty crazy howls, and I was just stricken by that so much. It kind of filled me with terror but intrigue at the same time. And I remember thinking, because I'd already been up to the North Carolina mountains on a vacation prior to that as a kid, because the whole focus back then, of course, was on the Pacific Northwest only. And I remember thinking while I was watching this, well, Georgia has mountains. Maybe they're in Georgia, you know. So I had this really early interest, but it kind of faded out as I became a teenager and just got interested in teenager things. So when this occurred in the Okefenokee, I had totally lost all of my interest or even thought about any of this stuff until that morning there when we first woke up and we were doing the breakfast thing and I heard these crazy vocalizations or howls or whatever they were. And then the sighting, which, you know, it's one thing that they say about belief and disbelief, and those are kind of two sides of the same coin. You just kind of religiously accept something is or isn't. But it's another thing to have it then drop in your lap where you have no choice now but to know that it is, you know. And I guess for me the worst part about it was my roommate that was there with me it just never came up again. We couldn't, and I just had to tuck it in and stuff it down and get on with life. And that was
we talked about that.
Yeah.
We mentioned that a little bit, that it was kind of almost a tragedy that your roommate, it was just too far out there for him to discuss, because there's really a benefit, especially if two people have seen something, to be able to kind of share that burden amongst themselves. But quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just curious about the vocals. You said you heard some vocals. Can you give us some details on those? They had a kind of howl quality, but it was like, to me, there was more than one tone going on at the same time. So even though there was this high end, I felt I was picking up on a much lower frequency happening at the same time. And that's why I kept parsing it out, because I've been camping a good bit, and I know that foxes can make some pretty crazy sounds, and so can coyotes. But there was a lower frequency that my ears were picking. The craziest thing is nobody else was even aware of this. Of course, they were all hamming it up and kidding around, so it's kind of surprising that I picked up on it. But for whatever reason I did. And when I asked them about it, nobody heard it. And of course, they already know even though I'd kind of lost interest in Bigfoot at that point, I was the guy that was always talking about UFOs and crop circles and all that kind of stuff. So they were like, kind of poking fun of me already, just ribbing, good-natured ribbing. But to me, it had too much of a low and a high frequency at the same time. And as I'd stated to you, though, it was loud, but you could also tell it seemed quite a ways away. It was having to travel through a lot of trees, through a lot of pine forest. I mean, the Okefenokee has got so much pine forest that I couldn't be sure myself. But it just struck me as weird. It's like one of those things when you have a gut feeling there's something odd about that sound. As I said, I've heard many fox sounds, and I know they even do some sounds that almost sound like a human baby crying, and they're really weird. But I couldn't be 100% sure. And, of course, eventually I was like, oh, well, whatever, get on with the day. I'm hanging out with the guys. I just thought, accompanied by the interesting aspect that eventually it was accompanied by that sighting.
in our camping area was probably a mile, I would guess, or a mile and a half from where the sighting occurred. So I was going to say even that I think, and I'm just guessing here, but, and believe me, I mean, no offense to people that are religious. I believe in God, even though I don't have a specific denomination. I was raised a Catholic. Bob was a devoted Catholic. And maybe that's why he didn't want to address it. Somehow it might have messed with it's funny when you talk with some people who are really religious and they can't somehow fit the idea of a proto-human or something within their wheelhouse, you know?
Right. Yeah, no, I understand that. I've, and, you know, I'm a person of faith myself, and to me, it's not a problem at all. It's you know, it's just one of the things that's out there. And so,
right.
And, you know, you talk about the sound that the creature makes. Yeah. And when you hear it, even if you are not intimately familiar with all the sounds of you know, in the wilderness, there's something about it that grabs you, and you just know that this is very, very different. It's something about it that almost doesn't belong.
Yeah, it's you know, like that was actually in the morning. If I had heard that sound while we were getting ready for bed at night, I would have gotten a lot more scared. You know what I mean? There's that thing about daylight that somehow brings some degree of comfort.
Yes, it does.
But I had heard weird sounds on Billy's Island too. But once again, it was similar to that. I wasn't in Sasquatch mode like I am now all the time. And I just didn't know where to put it, how to categorize this. And I did keep thinking, well, that's probably just a fox sound, and I'm not aware that they have that range of vocal, or maybe a coyote. I don't know about coyote. I'm sure they're down there. I don't know about coyote populations in the Okefenokee. I'd have to look into that. I'm certain they're there. I mean, we have them all down here in around Savannah. I've even got them right here in my neighborhood. Lately, they've kind of gotten really abundant and have become kind of a concern. I have a 5-year-old child that I feel like, because they've been floating around here a lot, I've got to kind of keep an eye on even more than you normally would, you know. But we're all kind of get familiar with that. Do y'all remember that vocalization recorded in West Virginia on a rainy day in the middle of nowhere? Like you can hear the chickens going off. And even if you haven't heard that one, the sound is one that's so familiar to anybody into this subject, that huge wailing sound that almost actually sounds mournful.
Yeah, I haven't quite heard that, but I've heard the screams and the barks and something. It's sort of a wailing. It's, you know, it starts low and it goes to a very high pitch.
That's what I'm talking about. It starts low and it soars up higher and higher. And it's almost got this mournful quality to it. And I guess the person was on the porch and just heard it, so they turned on their phone. And it's been analyzed just like the Sierra sounds have. And, you know, it falls above and below human range. It's so much bigger than a human could ever. I grant you there's some people that can do some pretty good calls, but they're still really limited in their range.
Yeah, they don't have physiology. Yeah.
Right. So that got me, you know, like I wanted to get, you know, like I wanted to talk with Bob later when we got back home about it, but there was just, you know, I found a couple of ways to try to enter into it. He just didn't want to talk about it. It's funny when somebody can subconsciously, they're already acting out, trying to find something else to divert from that, whatever the subject is, it makes them uncomfortable. So we never got to talk about it again. I tried to enter into it once or twice, and I could see it was going nowhere. So I left it alone. I'm like, well, I guess I got to tuck this down too, because none of my other friends were, you know, into that subject at the time. And I think I got back into the subject in 2008 when my twin brother called me up telling me there's been a Bigfoot found in North Georgia. And, of course, it turned out to be the whole Rick Dyer hoax, which, you know, it was like, oh, God. But it's the same thing. That reinvested myself in the interest into the whole subject, and I've been into it ever since. You know,
so let me ask you this. So you, real quick, so you're I just want to go back to this encounter. You're canoeing along, and you guys are, it sounds like you were being quiet. You probably weren't talking or making a lot of noise in the canoe.
We were, just silently cruising.
Okay. You see this ruckus. It stands up, and it walks off into the woods. Both of
and
you,
it's like I said, as it's standing, it's doing a turning. It's literally turning as it's standing up.
Okay.
And then it just starts walking off into the woods. And then Bob is staring. I'm staring. We're totally silent at that point because we're just focused on what we're watching happen. And then it disappears. We both look back at each other in the canoe. I'm worried about tipping over the canoe. I'm so shaken by the whole thing, you know, and there's loads of gators in that water. And the last thing I want to do is tip the canoe. And Bob and I are just completely like you would expect to happen. Like, what was that? You know, while at that point, you know, we're like, what did you see? We pretty much saw the same thing. Bob agreed that granted, in my memory, I'm the one that kind of prodded on it, how it looked. But Bob agreed it had shoulders. It wasn't a bear. I'm not saying bears don't have shoulders, but you know what I mean. They don't protrude. They're built in. And this thing clearly had these huge sloped shoulders and these massive arms and just didn't even move like a bear. I think one of the most interesting things about seeing what happened was it reminds me of all these other reports where people describe them as almost look like they're floating. They're moving so smoothly, you know. And this thing was having to move over thicket and branches to get away from us, which is clearly what it wanted to do. We were disturbing it. And yet still, I can imagine if I were in that area where he was trying to get around and over that stuff, I would have probably been tripping, you know what I mean? And so we sat there just dumbfounded and doing the whole, oh my God, what was that? You know, and at some point we're like, well, he's out of sight and we're just sitting in this tributary. So we decided to paddle back, and we both talked about this because my first thought was, how are we not going to talk about this? We got to share this. And Bob was like, these guys will tear us apart for the rest of, and they would have. Even though they gave me the good-natured ribbing earlier about that sound, it would have been, and they were just they were good guys, but they were a hardcore group of people that when they found some weakness in somebody or something they thought was silly, they dove in for the blood, you know what I mean? And so we agreed just to not bring it back up. Now, we didn't talk about whether we were going to discuss it later. We went back into silence for the rest of the paddling. I think both of us just like, I just had to get with myself on it for a while, and I guess he did too on the paddle back after we went through this initial just absolute, like, it's one of those things, you know, when something happens, you're like, did that really happen? Did I really just see what I thought I saw? You're already second-guessing yourself after it's happened because it's so outside of anything that you can imagine, you know, or that you would have imagined. Like, as much as I used to be interested in Bigfoot, I still wouldn't have been able to believe my eyes if one came up on me, you know, like, it's that weird thing I believe and I don't believe, or I want to believe, but then I'm sure it'll never happen. And I think
you know, it's too bad. Yeah, no, it's too bad you guys couldn't have gone back. I don't know what the ground was like, but it'd be interesting to see if you could have gone back and checked for footprints.
I know. You're right. You know, the ground would be, like I said, the water kind of comes up into some of that growth. And then you're still dealing with, like, even like where I live here with the Ogeechee River, it could be a thing where muddy tracks would have been able to be found, like not really good impressions because it's too soft of a soil, if you know what I mean. You can have too hard of a soil or too soft of a soil, but down in there, it surely would have left some kind of, you know, even if they weren't detailed impressions, because the water would sink back in around it, you know. That's my guess. But Yeah, there wasn't even any, now if this happened to me in 2008 or beyond, I would have definitely, that's would have been my thought, because now I'm always in researcher mode. I've got the addiction.
And what year was
now,
this? I know you said, what year did
I'm
this
almost
happen?
certain it was 95, but we did 2 years in row to row, 95 and 96, but I'm pretty sure it was 1995.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, if that's the correct year, when we got there, people were still talking about the fact that, this man went to Billy's Island in January, I think, of that year. Might have been 94. I'm going to get really confused now, but this 300-pound man who is an experienced camper went to Billy's Island, and he went missing and did not turn up for 40 days. He had lost almost 100 pounds. They had used infrared lights with helicopters looking for him. It was just bizarre. Nobody knows what happened to this guy, except that at one point somewhere in that journey, it made hard copy and all those shows from back in the 90s. Some point in that journey out there on Billy's Island, a couple said they saw a guy at the edge of the forest near the water, and they asked him if he was okay, and he said yes. But what he claims is he has no recollection of those 40-something days at all. So it was really weird.
Obviously, he must have done something to, obviously he had some way to get food and water, otherwise.
Clearly.
40
a lot
days,
of people thought he was just trying to pull some stunt to get, and that's possible, but it's interesting that Billy's Island is, I guess, maybe 5 or 6 miles long, but it's only a couple miles wide. It's just weird to me that the helicopters wouldn't have been able to find him. Or if he wanted out of there, though, the other question is, why wouldn't he just light a fire and get smoke going, So that was interesting, but that was still a big subject when we got there.
Oh, okay. Well, and I'm looking at this area, Billy's Island, and this is just due north of the center of Florida's, the state line between Florida and Georgia.
That's right. Part of the swamp does go down into Florida. It's massive. You could go in there if you didn't know what you're doing. You could go in there. I know the Adirondacks or basically New York. The mountains in New York are probably one of the bigger areas of any place, even counting Washington. But 450,000 acres is nothing. And when you go into a swamp, it becomes a labyrinth, and you can just get lost in there. But you go back in there, and it's so primordial. It's just like you're really back into a different time frame. And I can't imagine why they wouldn't be in there. And now I know they are, So that was my first experience. And it's still my only sighting, but I've had a lot of other experiences in what I would call either evidence gathering or encounters of some form or another where clearly to me, a lot of things that have happened to me and since then are things that I would read about by other people, things that have happened. And when it happens to me, you go, oh, that really is a thing. They do smack the walls of houses and cabins, because I had that occur to me. Or they do throw rocks. Have that rock thrown at me? Real quick, I'll just tell you that since I've gotten back into the subject, the areas where I have gone to do the most research are in 2015 when I lived in St. Augustine, Florida, and I had a couple of wildlife management areas that I went to on the one day off I had down there, which was Sundays. I worked pretty much 10-hour days, Monday through Saturday down there. This area where I live, Savannah, and then more than anything else, the Appalachians of North Georgia and North Carolina, specifically the Fort Mountain area in Georgia, also around Helen, Georgia, and Saluda, North Carolina. And I've repeated visits to all those places and always have had something that intrigues me occur or find something that's intriguing. So we'll leap into I think it was 2017. In 2016, we got hit by a hurricane here, and it wasn't a direct hit, but it did a lot of damage out here. And, of course, the power is out for 2 weeks. So in 2017, we got hit by another hurricane. and the power was out again. And there was tension amongst people living in this house that I'm in because of the heat and the power outage, and Stacy and myself, and we just picked up our son, who was at the time about 2 years old, and said, let's go to the mountains and get away from this, let them deal with this for right now. I won't get into the dynamics of the family construct here, but it's just one where there's a lot of different personalities getting involved, and normally we get along fine. But so we went up to an area that we'd been before where it had activity, which is it's in between Ellijay and another town west of there that I can't think of the name right now, but this is north of Atlanta, maybe an hour and a half. It's getting into the Cohutta Wilderness. And we were set to actually be in the exact same cabin that we'd gone to back in 2014. But because the hurricane had actually moved up through there as a tropical storm, it had washed out the long, steep dirt road that would go to that cabin. So she called me and said, would you mind checking into another cabin? And I said, no, I guess I don't have a choice. So she set me up with this place called Bear Cabin, and it couldn't have been more perfect because it sat by itself on a cul-de-sac. And instead of being around other cabins, now there were big mansions here and there on the way down the road that weren't occupied, but its backyard was Cohutta Wilderness all the way up into Tennessee. So you know what I mean? It was just there. Who knows? There may have been a dirt road here and there somewhere, but it was just pure wilderness. And so, of course, I'm super excited about this because by this time, 2017, I am full on in Bigfoot mode, And I don't know if y'all have had that feeling when you're being watched. Do y'all buy into that feeling that you can pick up sometimes when you're being watched?
I don't know how to describe it. I've had a feeling where it was more of a feeling of, a friend of mine describes it as being in a graveyard at midnight. So just kind of a strange feeling.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we got there at nighttime, and I was loading in. The driveway goes downhill to the backyard, and the backyard is there's about 20 feet of grass before it gets to the wood line. This could have just been me being scared as shit, right? Excuse my French. I'm going to bleep that out. But I had this feeling I was being watched as I kept unloading luggage in through the back door while Stacey was getting our son and our dog situated in the house. And the dog plays into this, by the way, later. So I got all situated in the house, and, we got settled in, we had something quick to eat, maybe watched a little TV and went to bed. And the next morning I got up, and, of course, my first order of business after making them breakfast was, let me go into the wood line. And I don't know where y'all's position is on stick stuff, too. I thought I'd heard Will say that you don't place a lot of faith in stick structures or glyphs.
I think, yeah, okay, so tree breaks, and there's a very specific type of tree breaks and very specific criteria for that. Will, maybe you can comment on that. But on the tree structures, I think it's up there with a lot of other things. It would just need to get some confirmation.
Yeah, the details, sure. So, Will, do you have some input on that?
Well, on a lot of the structures, I've been a lot of places on the coast and have never seen anything like that myself. And people post things on Facebook, and my biggest question is, how do you know a Sasquatch did that? If they're making things, number one, what's the purpose? Secondly, there'd be a lot of secondary evidence around it.
Right. That's a good point. Like, nobody's ever actually seen a Sasquatch making a structure as far as I know. That being said, are y'all familiar with Christopher Noel? He's a researcher.
Yeah, I've heard of him. Yeah.
He's a researcher up in Vermont. And when he finds a lot of these bizarre stick and tree anomalies, what he does is he sets up field recorders at night. And he said if you just had the structures alone, it might, but I've listened to him pour through some insane sounds at night, like the sounds of what sounds like bigger than sapling trees being snapped, and grunts and whoops. And so anyway, my point being, I admit that you've got to kind of be cautious with the stick things. But the first thing I saw in this tree right in the woodline was a massive branch about 12 feet up laying in the tree. It was too big of a branch to belong to the tree. And now, you know, who knows, the hurricane might have thrown it in there, but there was no tree nearby that was big enough to produce the size of the branch or the type of tree it was, which I couldn't identify. That was enough to encourage me or intrigue me anyway, even if it totally turns out to be nothing. But what I did was I went a little further into the woodline, and I took 3 roughly foot-long, see if you can picture this, 3 roughly foot-long sticks, and put them on the ground in a triangle. I found a snail shell. I put it down in the middle of the triangle with the whole side, the side the snail would come out of, down. And at the lower part of the triangle, I put an equal sign kind of straddling. Don't ask me why. This is just me trying to be creative. Went back inside, you know, hung out with the family. We had lunch. And this is if I'm rambling, let me know, but there's quite a bit that went on in this particular trip to this cabin. At some point, I decided to get the dog out, and we started walking around the cul-de-sac and up the road, and we came up to this deep ravine. This is the middle of the day. And he started intently looking down in the ravine, like just staring. He wasn't barking, but he was staring, and he had a weird kind of expression. Douglas was kind of like he was a bird dog, kind of mixed with a border collie. That's what he looked like, about a 60-pound dog. I took a large branch and decided, well, you know, I've never done this, but I'm going to do, well, yeah, I had before once or twice, but I was going to do a tree knock. And so I found a heavy, pretty solid pine branch, and I knocked it against a tree, and it made a good sound that reverberated through the mountains there. Kind of sounded like a pop fly, like if a baseball player. And then within a very short time, and I mean seconds, I got 3 knocks back. And when I say knocks, these things sounded like trees hitting trees. It had much more, it was huge. So Douglas is still just staring and getting all kind of antsy and, you know, but looking down there and getting kind of hyper. And so I did one more knock, and I got 3 more knocks back. And I ended up walking him back to the cabin from there, and there was one more single knock that occurred on the way back to the cabin. The reason why I say my dog is important in this, we live where we have wooded area here, and my dog Douglas loved to go running through the woods. He would just traipse, and he would chase deer, and even though he's a bird dog, I never trained him to hunt, but he had some of these natural instincts, and he loved the forest. At night, every night at that cabin, I could not get him outside, even dragging him with the leash. He had this look like, don't do this to me. He wouldn't go out. I couldn't get him to do his business, and somebody managed to hold it in all the way till morning. Because one time I drug him out made him walk with me about 50 feet, and he still wouldn't do anything. He just insisted on turning around. And that happened every night. I was like, well, I guess he's just not going to do this. So the very next day, though, I went to go check my little glyph I made, and nothing had happened to it. It was still there. I was like, okay, I'm probably just, you know. Point being, it was 2 days later, I went back and checked it. So imagine this. Remember the snail shell was in the center of the triangle? Well, the snail shell was now perfectly in what I would call the capstone, like if you think about the pyramid on the dollar bill. The snail shell was perfectly in the capstone of the triangle, and the equal sign is no longer straddling the bottom part of the triangle, but the middle where the snail shell used to be. And it was perfectly arranged. It wasn't like somehow a raccoon had stepped over this and had managed to, you know what I mean, or a possum. The triangle was still perfectly put together. The equal signs were still perfect, just moved up. And the snail shell was in the capstone with the whole side turned up instead of down. And from that point forward at night, every night, the cabin was getting smacked by something, and I mean loud. And if you could picture the cabin, even though it's in a massively wooded area. All the trees had been pruned away from the cabin, so nothing was overhanging the roof at all. You know, you had a good 20 feet or more where the edge of the trees would even be near where the roof line. And this clearly wasn't the roof. It was the walls of the cabin being smacked. My wife was even like, what is that? I was like, I don't know. But it occurred every night. And I would say as many as 4 to 5 whacks on the walls of the cabin every night. And what we started doing was she at that point got interested in it. So we started setting up glyphs with sticks on the other side of the cabin, like the cul-de-sac side. And there was, here's the biggest thing. Now, I'm taking pictures of all this. I have a Droid. But I also brought an iPhone with me because I'm a musician, and I only use my iPhone. I had GarageBand in it, so I could use it for songwriting. And I brought my guitar up there. I didn't use my iPhone as a phone to talk on. I didn't use it for taking pictures. It was exclusively if I needed to do songwriting ideas. So I am taking pictures of these things I'm seeing, including an area where they apparently would come up on raiding a bee's nest. And I've got a photograph of that where you can see the fingerprints pulling out. There's no claw marks. Bears do not have retractable claws. And you can see where the fingers had drug out this nest that was in the ground. I mean, we came up on it. The bees were all stirred up, so I knew it had just happened. And I can send you all that picture later. But here's the weirdest,
absolutely. Please do.
Here's the weirdest thing about the whole trip. So one morning I get up. I was grilling on the back porch every night, and the back porch, of course, faced the backyard. And one morning I get up, and I was like, where's my phone? I realized I'd left it out on the grill. Well, I went out there, and it wasn't there, but I thought, okay, you just don't remember where you put it. So I checked all around the grill. I checked in the grass below the porch. Then, of course, we do an exhaustive search inside. I go back on the porch, and the other thing that was missing, interestingly enough, was the grill brush. The grill brush, this was one of the nastiest grill brushes you've ever seen. I would have never brought it inside. Like the renters should have replaced that brush by now. So here's where it gets really weird. Now, the grill brush and the phone were gone. So, you know, that was near the end of the trip. So I didn't even have my phone set up for anything other than just what I was doing with GarageBand. It wasn't set up for phone communication, my iPhone. We ended up getting packed up as it was time to leave, and we drove back home. And this is where it's a little weird because I can't give you where I remember this happening. But there are pictures from that trip that I took with the Droid loaded into my computer down here in Savannah. Later, I double-checked. I went into my iPhone because obviously, since I was missing the other phone, I had to set up my iPhone. I've gone back in there and checked my earliest pictures. My earliest pictures are when we got back to Savannah. Yet somehow there are pictures from the mountain trip in the computer. I still, to this day, don't know how to make sense of that. I didn't have any remote capability of loading pictures into my computer from there. Matter of fact, we didn't even have service where we were. You couldn't get service from her phone or my Droid, even texting. You couldn't do it. It was too down into the mountain. So there's that. Y'all expound on this some if you want, because I've got more stuff to say.
Well, I'm going to ask
get y'all's
real
views
quick.
on
I'm
things.
just going to. So, the computer, is it a PC or a Mac or?
It's PC.
PC. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The weirdest thing is I don't remember. This is one that gets back to that memory thing. Like, even if I had brought that phone back to Savannah with me, I don't remember loading anything into the computer, but the phone has been gone since I was up in the mountains. And I know it might seem funny that thinking of Bigfoot as stealing a phone, but then again, that might be they're curious about stuff that we have. You've read the stories where they seem to be interested in Mylar balloons or blue cans and weird stuff like that. I don't know what the truth of that matter is. I haven't experienced any of that. And maybe they don't play into it all, but it was still very bizarre. And I can send some of those pictures, especially the one with the fingerprints pulling that nectar or whatever it is. how they got, not all of them loaded, just some of them. But I can send those to you, along with whatever else. The thing with the glyphs that Stacy and I started making on the other side of the cabin was we'd go for walks with the dog and our kid and come back an hour later, and the glyph is already in some different position. And there are at this time was early in the season, it was late in the season. Those mansions I mentioned on the road down, we checked, all of them were vacant. This isn't a place that has hiking trails or any of that stuff. You go out in the woods and you're in the woods. I didn't see any evidence of other humans. So one time I did an interview on a podcast called The Right to Reason, and this guy's whole goal was to tear me down about Sasquatch because he doesn't believe in it. And he's like, well, maybe your wife, knows you're into it, so she was willing to pay a guy to go follow y'all up there and do this stuff. I'm like, you don't know about my wife and money, do you? It's like when Philip Klass, and I don't know where y'all stand on UFOs. I used to be really interested in it. I'm not that interested in the subject anymore. But there's something to it, even if it's just military stuff. And when that skeptic Philip Klass...
They're very interesting. But
when
nonetheless,
Philip Klass label everything as swamp gas, I'm like, clearly we're dealing with something other than swamp gas. Sometimes what these skeptics do is, my problem with skeptics is simply this. If they haven't done the research and the time themselves, other than just dismissing, and a lot of them do that, you don't have any right to offer your opinion. You need to get both sides or all sides of a story before you make an educated, and for, anyway, it was an
my thought.
Podcast.
The skeptics are one thing. I'm okay with honest skeptics. It's the debunkers and the scoffers that I have problems with. And so when they're in the process, they're scoffing. My question is I don't recall seeing you out there when I saw this or whatever it was. And there's a guy out there, Thinker Thunker. I kind of like some of his stuff. And he really summed it up really well. He said the assets, he calls them skeptics, but I'll call them debunkers or scoffers. Their main assets are they have a lack of information, they have a lack of interest, they have a lack of curiosity, but they got an opinion on everything.
That's a good point.
And he's being very polite. I actually have 2 words for the debunkers like that. They're not thank you. We'll just leave it at that. It's seriously, you see them quite a bit, and they have.
Well, this guy is one of those guys.
This whole business of maybe your wife hired somebody is so far out.
That's more absurd than to accept any other possibility.
Yes,
even if it's not Sasquatch,
Absolutely.
it's still, And granted, there are a lot of charlatans out there, and they're hoaxes. We know that. For the most part, they tend to out themselves because most of that stuff is pretty. I don't know. I'm not quick to go label somebody something. And as a matter of fact, I won't even label them that. I'll just, if I offer my opinion on something online, it's like, this doesn't look like this to me, or, it seems that one of the things that Thinker Thunker did to me is his work on the body proportions, along with Bill Munn's on Patty, is like, I don't know where y'all stand on that. I used to go back and forth, and of course, science always says we need a species type or DNA, but the body proportions on Patty are simply not human. They're just not. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the subject of the film, not Patterson's reputation as a con man or whatever.
Let me ask you this.
Did you see where he put what?
Well, I was going to. I agree with you entirely. Bill Munns did a very exhaustive analysis and on the Patty film, and it was not somebody in a suit. You had mentioned you'd had some other encounters. I was curious, what else have you encountered out there? Okay,
so I told you that I've been up to Saluda, North Carolina before. I've got a friend that has a cabin up there on the Green River. And, of course, we were dying to just get up there and spend some time anyway. She's an old friend of mine, and she lives in Athens, which is where I met her. I spent about 10 years in Athens, Georgia. So we kept talking about getting up there. And we went up there in 2016. I think we also went up there that same year at some other point in 2017, or maybe it was 18. But I had some things occur there. I found, once again, when I'm involved, a tree knock. We were going down alongside of a mountain on this path. So the mountain was the incline was to our right and the decline was to our left as we were going along. And we kept going and we came up to an impassable river. So we had to turn around. So at this point, the incline is to our left and the decline is to our right. And once again, since I've gotten some results from tree knocks a couple of times, I did a tree knock, and this was crazy. I did this tree knock, and I thought it wasn't really satisfactory to my ears. I immediately started looking for another, better branch, and a rock about the size of, not quite the size of my heel, came down and missed my foot at baseball pitcher speed within a matter of 3 seconds after doing that tree knock. And it came down from the incline. And if you looked up the incline, there was so much underbrush and stuff, I can't see how a rock that size could have got any kind of momentum to come down and hit directly at an angle. In other words, it didn't come like it was rolling down the hill. It came down at an angle towards my foot and ricocheted. And I had to actually see it. It ricocheted off a rock that was on the path. And my first thought was, my son, he's 30 feet behind me with my wife. If that rock had hit him, it would have hurt him. It would have killed him or anything, but it would have hurt him because it came down with speed. And I didn't know what to make of that, except maybe I did a tree knock and maybe there were some of them up there and they're like, yeah, we know you're here. Keep going. That's the only message I got from that. But at that same cabin, the first time we were there, I got up one morning and same thing, went out. It's just about sun up and I did a tree knock. And it's interesting that when I told you about the other tree knocks when we were up in Fort Mountain, I would do one knock and get 3 knocks back, and I did that twice. I went out. I always do one knock when I do them. I don't do 3. I notice a lot of people do 3. I went in out from the cabin about 75 yards, and I did a tree knock. And I listened for a few seconds and well, I'm not going to hear anything. Let me head back to the cabin. Then I got 3 tree knocks from behind me. And on the right as the third knock hits, you hear a cracking sound, and a full tree fell. I could feel it. A full tree hit the ground, and I'm guessing at this, but it couldn't have been more than 7,500 yards behind me. So I thought, well, that was interesting. So I just went right back inside. And once again, in terms of tree structure stuff, I did find some things that were interesting, things where trees are placed a certain way, and yet the root ball is not there where this big branch is. There's no evidence that the branch fell from a tree directly above it. That's why I'm still intrigued by it. I do have to insist that since none of us have witnessed this stuff happening, but have you all ever looked at the videos of that guy that goes by Colorado Bigfoot?
I have.
Either of them?
Yeah, I've seen some of his stuff, and really hard to say. It's a lot of tree structures. Don't know what.
Well, here's my take on him. Now, I don't necessarily agree with him philosophically about maybe much, but I remember seeing his footage, and this is probably 12,000 feet up, no sign of machinery anywhere. A full tree, might have been 60, 70 feet long, apparently plucked out of the ground, and it was woven between standing trees like you would thread a needle. And when I saw that, I'm like, I don't know, maybe this is some other phenomena altogether. But he couldn't have faked that. He wouldn't, he couldn't do it, unless it's all CGI. And there's nothing in his videos that tell me they're CGI. Now, like I said, I don't necessarily go for what he's pretty on the paranormal side of things, which, I'm open to, but not, I don't, I'm like, until I know the bare bones of something, I'm not going to go off any further.
Sure.
It's just like the people that think there's some people that think they're benevolent, other people think they're malevolent. I'm like, who knows? There might be a mix, but I definitely, there's enough stories to show that it's not something you necessarily need to take lightly when you go out into the woods if you're actually looking for them, you know?
Yeah, very much so. I got one of my thoughts on the tree structures are here in the Northwest. It's wintertime right now, so we're getting a lot of storms and wind and that sort of thing. And when I go back to the areas that I'm very, very familiar with, even the hiking trails and that sort of thing, right off the trails, unless the Bigfoots are just incredibly busy out there doing this sort of thing, there's a ton of tree structures. There's a ton of woven trees, and also, you know, I don't want to underestimate the power of nature to go out and do a lot of things that seem to our mind to be very, very impossible or very, how could that happen naturally? Well, I don't know how they do. They either do, or the creatures are just out there doing an awful lot of work during the wintertime.
It's a good point. They would have to, if they're physically out there pulling these things out and doing this, it would seem to take up pretty much all of their time. I have to admit that.
And it's interesting. I got to say, it'd be really fascinating if they were going out and creating these tree structures. Now we spoke with a gentleman a while back, him and his wife, in Canada, and Will, I don't remember that, where they actually had a like a blind. It looked like maybe one of the creatures had built the blind, and that was something that served a purpose.
Right.
Yeah. See, now I saw something like that in Pine Mountain, Georgia, which is on the west side of Georgia, near Columbus and close to Alabama. I think that was 16. Went camping there, and I went out in the middle of the night with a flashlight and found some interesting stuff. And this stuff did not have any like organizational structure, but it was literally covering about more than a half a football field's length, what appeared to be a semicircle of just trees dragged in and forming a wall. And it seemed to me like that could have definitely served as a blind. The other thing I thought was interesting on that trip was I talked to one of the rangers about the wildlife there. And as any of you know, raccoons are everywhere, right? So he had come down from North Georgia. He actually used to be up at the Cohutta Wilderness, where I told you some of my incidents had occurred. When he'd been down there a couple of years, I said, well, how about the wildlife here? I'm sure you got plenty of deer. Do you have any bears? He said, a few bears moved through here. I said, what about raccoons? He goes, the 2 years I've been here, I've never seen a raccoon. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, and my thought was, why would there be no raccoon in this whole area in Pine Mountain? You know, I didn't have any answer for that. It's just weird, because if you look at the ranges of raccoon, they're just everywhere.
Raccoons are everywhere. They're in the backyard of people's houses and suburbs. And
that's right. They can survive anywhere. And another interesting thing I'd found back on the Fort Mountain thing was, we're walking up a trail. This is back in 2014, the first time I'd gone up that area. I went off trail about 50 yards because I saw these huge, like granite-like rocks. The interesting thing about these two rocks were, and I have these pictures too. Now, all these other pictures from my 2013 and 14 forays into the mountains, they're sitting in a computer here that's not currently turned on. It's sitting up here in the attic, and I do want to get back into there and get some of those things out of there. Because I've got a footprint that I found on a riverbank that I videoed that the thing about this foot track that was in this sandbank next to the Soquee River, this is outside of Helen, Georgia, the bank was always wet because of the splashing water. The sandbank was always wet, but you could see the water just constantly hitting from the rocks. Because at first I thought, well, maybe the bank was a softer sand when this foot impression was made. But then after looking at it, I could tell this is constantly going to stay wet because of the way the water's splashing and hitting it. My point is, I, at the time, weighed about 205 pounds, and I put my shoe a few inches away from that footprat and started not just stepping up with my weight, I was pushing my foot into the ground. And I could only get like a couple of millimeters registered into the bank. And this thing clearly had somewhere between a quarter to a half inch impression. So that was one of the first things. That just kind of occurred to me when I was telling you about this Fort Mountain trip too. But sorry that I'm so back and forth. I don't have all this it's not like it's all like I got it all organized by time. But these two granite rocks that I found, they were big, and they were interestingly fairly rectangular. You know, I mean, they were natural formations, but they just had a fairly symmetrical rectangular shape to them. Both of them had been perfectly lifted up on their side so that there was an impression where they used to sit, and if you were to flip them back down, you wouldn't have to move it or anything. It would just fall back on like a door closing and go back into that impression. And the reason I thought it was interesting, because I could clearly see a bear pulling up these things looking for something to forage, but I just can't see a bear with its ungainly strength pushing this rock up without having slid it at all. At either one of these. They were just perfectly opened up like a door from the ground with, you know, it had clearly been done a while back because there were a few weeds growing up in there, but the impressions were still there where those rocks were. I couldn't see a raccoon even having the strength to do it. The rocks are big enough for that. But even then, I can't imagine them, if they could, doing it without sliding the rocks to some degree. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff that's real kind of wishy-washy. It's not exactly evidence, but it's intriguing, you know. And you find a lot of stuff like that up in those. You know the guy that has the Bigfoot Museum up in Cherry Log, Georgia, David Bacara?
I think we've heard that there is indeed a museum up there. Yeah.
Well, that whole area is the area I'm talking about. I'm just going to say it. That whole area is very squatchy. And that brings to mind another subject I would like to talk with y'all about and get y'all's opinion on. Is just continental U.S. If you have any rough guesstimate of what you think their numbers are, because I'm not saying they're everywhere, but I don't know if I agree with Meldrum's, and I think, don't get me wrong, Meldrum's contribution to the subject cannot be overestimated, but I don't agree with his numbers estimates. Like he guesses there might be 300 in all of Washington State. And when Washington State's like 62,000 plus square miles, and
yeah,
when you consider how
he's way short, way short.
Yeah. I mean, look, Georgia is not near as big as Washington, and Georgia has the most counties of any. If we just, instead of doing it by square miles, we went by counties. Georgia has like 156 counties. If Georgia is almost half the size of Washington, so let's just use his numbers and say there's 150 Sasquatch living in Georgia, and that means basically one per county if you actually divided them up that way, when I'm not saying they would actually divide it up like there'd be areas where they live and areas where they don't. You're never going to find anything ever in terms of evidence or experience if there's one per, you know.
And 300 doesn't give you a viable breeding population.
That's also yeah. So what are y'all's thoughts? Because it's something that I'm really curious about. And I have no way of gauging. I just know that estimate sounds so low.
Yeah, there does need to be a sustainable breeding population throughout North America. So I don't know, Will, what are your thoughts as far as potential population density?
Well, I've mentioned this before. My sources, and I'm not going to say who they are, told me in the 50s, their estimate was around 50,000 on the continent. And it's higher than that since then, so.
Right. And that would definitely for me still be on the low side, but definitely much more realistic than in one of the areas that supposedly has the most sightings in the state. I mean, in the country.
We have a lot more than
300. Right. Another thing I have found that may or may not. A lot of what I have is stuff that's, you know, it's obviously it's just anecdotal, and it could be this or it could be that. But taken together, if I could document everything that I've experienced since like 2013 on, it's it seems to me there's some significance. One thing I've never experienced, other than at the Okefenokee, I've never experienced any more vocalizations, period, or not that I can recall. But I have experienced finding broken deer legs, or alternately I've found a deer carcass where the legs are broken off and not there. And the reason I bring that up is I've read accounts before of they like snapping off the legs and sucking the marrow out. Now, I could argue that maybe like the one deer I found on a dirt road in Midway, Georgia, maybe a car hit it and snapped its legs. I don't know. But the rest of the deer was gone. And even a deer, I know they have skinny legs. If you tried to take your hands and snap one of their bones, it's a lot harder. I don't think it could be done by any normal human. Those bones are hard.
No, they're very strong.
And they were not sawed. These were clearly snapped. In the instance
that's an interesting. Yeah, no, that's we've heard that before, and I think it's a very interesting observation probably attributed to what these creatures do. Well, listen, I want to thank you, Philip, for taking the time to come on the show. We really appreciate it. Fascinating, and although we won't put it on the website, I would encourage our listeners, if you're interested, Google Billy Island in Georgia, and the other one, or not Billy Island, or is it Billy Lake?
Billy's Island, and while they're there, if they can look up Minnie's Lake, and as I said, Bugaboo Island is a little bit southeast of Billy's Island, maybe about a couple of miles. But there's lots of lore down there too, as well as there's Florida. Florida's ripe with this stuff.
So it's Billy's Lake,
an honor to be on with y'all.
Well, absolutely. We really appreciate Philip, the time you took.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Listen, I'll put you in touch with Brian because he's in Florida, and we also have some folks in North Carolina that aren't too far away.
Awesome. Yeah.
In fact, we had Scott on last week, and we've got some other witnesses there, and Darcy also, who's going to join us in the next segment for the Q&A. So I'll get you in touch with some local people we've got there, so you're not alone.
I appreciate that. And on that note, real quick, and it's probably just been too long ago, but that woman that you interviewed, and she had moved from she had experiences in North Carolina, I believe that's correct, and she moved down here, and I swear she said she moved to Effingham County. Effingham County is the next county west of me and Chatham.
Do you recall?
There's so few people into this subject down here. Do you
recall if that was Nita by chance?
You asked me that, and I will never be able to remember her name, but she has had experiences in and around her house right out there in Effingham.
Yeah, let me check, and I'll see if I can't find her and get you in touch with her.
I mean, if to make her more comfortable, if you just said, well, this guy, not give her, I'm obviously not asking you just throw me your contact, but maybe if you know her, contact her and say there's a guy that lives just a little bit east of you who's curious to hear more.
Sure.
Sure. So,
all right,
thank you guys. This has been wonderful.
We appreciate it.
Yeah. And maybe we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Philip, you stay in touch with us.
I will. Y'all take care.
Welcome back from the break, everyone. Darcy's joining Tom and I. Darcy, you've been messaging me about some stuff that's been going on. Apparently, your nephew moved in, and he was somewhat of a non-believer, but things have been happening.
Oh, yes, most definitely.
Can you take us through that?
He's been here about 3 or 4 months, and he would joke, I said, well, we've got our little neighbor out there. And he said, oh, yeah, Aunt Darcy, ha, ha, ha. Not really taking it serious. So he was using the back bedroom at the kitchen, which I've moved out of and moved up to the front one because I know what happens in the back of the house. And something stacked the back of the house, and he didn't think much of it, but it woke me up. And he said, Aunt Darcy, did you hear that fall off the tree last night? I said, nothing fell off the tree. It didn't hit the roof. I said, the house got smacked. He goes, what do you mean? I said, the house got smacked. That was the first time. And I said, he says, well, what smacked it? I said, what do you think? You know, I'm teasing him, but I'm being serious. He goes, oh, Aunt Darcy. So about a week later, it did it again, and this time it was really loud. And when I woke up, he was in the chair in the living room sleeping. And I said, now, I told you what's walking around the house. I told you to be careful when you walk out. Well, last week, we come in the house, couldn't smell anything, and this is like 8 o'clock at night. He says, oh, I got to go outside. I want to talk to my girlfriend in private. I said, well, go ahead. And he went to go out the front door, and the stench was so bad. And he says, Aunt Darcy, you smell that? I said, yeah, how about shutting the door? And he says, what is that? I said, what do you think it is? I said, you can't walk out there right now. You got to give it about 30, 40 minutes. I said, and then try it again. About 40 minutes later, he walked out, and there wasn't any odor, no nothing. He went on to his car and did what he had to do. And he come in, he says, Aunt Darcy, you really aren't joking about these things. I said, no, I'm being very, very, very serious. And he's coming just, you know, he doesn't want to say they exist, but he doesn't say they don't exist anymore. He doesn't think it's funny anymore.
You mentioned, too, that you guys went to a local store there and had an encounter with somebody else.
Yeah, I can't think of his name, and I apologize. We've talked about it several times. He's originally from Louisiana, but he's living here in North Carolina. And my nephew was saying, yeah, if I see one, I'm going to shoot. And I said, oh, no, you won't. We both said it at the same time. He said, because if there's one out there that you can see, there's at least 2 or 3 that you're not seeing. He goes, and when he realized someone else had actually seen it besides me in the same area and have heard them, he really took notice. He was like, maybe Aunt Darcy's not as crazy, you know. And I said, I told you I haven't been joking. I said, something that hits the back of the house. I said, if it's something falling off a tree, it's going to hit the roof, not the side of the house. And he says, correct. I said, so what do you think it is? I said, it wakes you out of your sleep. It shakes the back of the house. And let me just say that it's been a week ago since the incident of the smell, and he hasn't been back.
Now, when you say he hasn't been back, you're talking about the creature?
My nephew.
Or your nephew?
My nephew.
Okay.
Yep.
And is it because of he's become a believer, or?
Yeah, he's really come to the conclusion there's something out there.
Okay. And that's kind of spooked him, and now he's not staying there?
Nope, he's not staying here now.
Oh, okay. And what I was getting at was...
He said that was just too much for him.
Gotcha. That's where I was going with this. Okay. Wow.
And he's not young. He's young. You know, he's 26, 27, but he's not so young that... And he's a big boy. And it's freaked him out.
You know, I think it really bothers people when it sinks in that this is real. And then it's a whole different mindset when they realize it's not a joke anymore.
Oh, yeah, the smell really got him more than anything, because we had just come in the front door and there was no smell. Not even 3-4 minutes later, it hit him. And I'm thinking it had to be right there at the corner of the house where he couldn't see where it's dark. I said, boy, shut the door. Just give it about 30, 40 minutes and you can go on out there. And when he went back out there wasn't no smell, no nothing. And it wasn't a skunk smell. This is like more than sewage. It's awful.
You know, I've walked
Darcy,
into that.
Have you seen any...
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. So I was just going to ask real quick. Have you seen any footprints around the house? And more importantly, has your nephew seen any footprints?
I have a lot of foliage on the ground from the leaves and stuff I haven't raked up. The last footprint I had around the house, and I couldn't take a good photo, was at my back window when it come up to my back window at the kitchen. And it just wouldn't photograph good. You could physically see it, but when you went to take the photo, you couldn't. But other than that, no. I've had one in the front yard. I think I sent that to you, didn't I, Will?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. I've had, and that was, last summer, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a time frame.
Yeah. But But other than that, I don't see a lot. One, I don't go looking. That's the one thing you have to understand. I don't actually go out and seek any of this. It's just by happenstance that I've seen them.
Yeah. One thing I want to mention, Darcy, is, and this is really important, so this is for listeners out there, when you see a footprint on the ground, you're looking at it with stereoscopic vision because you're looking at it with two eyes. When you take a photograph of it, so many people are disappointed because they're like, you know, they have to offer an explanation. Well, it actually looks a little more defined than this, and sometimes it helps to have, you know, side light, you know, maybe a bright light so it produces some shadow so you get some definition.
Oh, yeah.
But I just want to mention that when you take a picture, the camera, you know, for all intents and purposes, it's looking at with one eye, one lens. But your eyes perceive it with two lenses, so it's stereoscopic, and you get a lot more definition. So I just wanted to kind of point that out.
Well, I told Will last week that I'm going to get sand and put around in certain places around my home. I'm going to clean up all the leaves, and I'm going to put sand down come the summer.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah. Because I know they're there, and I'm fine with it. I've come to accept that it just is. But for everybody that seeks them, I haven't sought them out. I haven't looked for them. It's just been by happenstance that I've come across them.
You know, that kind of goes into a question that I was given a couple of questions by a good friend of ours recently. And I know he's going to be listening, so I hope I don't butcher these. And if I do, you know, next time we chat, you can correct me on these. But the first one, and I'm going to pose it to you guys and our listeners also. And if everyone has some input, you know, email us at creekdevil.com and give us your thoughts on this. But the first question is, what do you think, or what do you believe we need in the way of proof to prove these creatures are real that will satisfy everyone? And Tom and Darcy, I'll let you guys kind of postulate that for a bit.
I could tell you right now, and it's a shame, the only way we're going to have real proof is for a dead body to actually come surface. Whether a hunter shoots it, an investigator, or whatnot, if you can stop the government from interfering. That's the only way most people are, and I hate that. I don't think shooting them is a good thing. That's the only way the general public's going to actually believe they exist.
I want to jump in. I agree with that. I think physical evidence in the form of a body, but then not only a body, but it needs to be a body that goes through the proper channels to be submitted to, you know, academic organization or whoever. You know, there needs to be some kind of a process, you know. And real quick, I just want to say that this is an opinion of mine. I don't have proof of this, but when people say, well, we need a body, where's the bones? Where's the body? Well, I think that's kind of a straw man argument, because the real question is, where are the bodies? Where are the bones? Because I think there's, I think they're out there. I think they exist. Yeah, well, and I'm fine. Yeah. I'm totally.
Let me take it a step. Let me take it a step further. Okay, let's go beyond. Let's say if we don't have a body, what do you think the next acceptable proof would be? Do you think a lot of film footage? Do you think, you know, other forms of physical evidence? What do you guys think? Do you think that would suffice to the general public?
Short of them having their own sighting, and I think that's what it's going to take for the non-believers, is to actually have their own sighting. I don't think photos are going to work. I don't think film's going to work. Because, you know, everything can be digitalized, and, you know, I think short of having their own sighting, they're just not going to believe it.
Mm-hmm. Tom, what do you think?
No, Darcy, you make a really good point. I would add to that, there's the possibility of, if you are going to do film, then you would want to preface it with supporting evidence to leading up to the film and explaining and validating the film itself. But also, let's go back to Tony, our judge, and what he said in the past, and I believe he even said it in your book, Bigfoot Evidence. There is far more existing evidence today for the reality of Bigfoot to submit it into a court of law. We've got eyewitness reports, we have physical, we do have photographs, we do have film, and we have footprints. And he said that's more than enough to put somebody away, let alone prove the existence of a creature. So I think there may be a little more to it.
Okay, well, let's go on to the next question. It's a little more thought-provoking, and hopefully I don't butcher it here. Who are you, each of us, included, once irrefutable proof is presented that these creatures do exist? So what are our thoughts on how to coexist with these creatures once they are proven to exist? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I'll jump in first. I don't know. This is just my opinion. I don't know that we can coexist with them. I think that they have animosity towards humans, and I just don't. We've had thousands of years, not centuries, but millennia, to figure out a way to coexist with them. The Native Americans, they've had millennia. If there was a way to do it, they would have figured it out by now. So I don't know. And also I think it's kind of a nebulous question in the sense that we don't really know exactly what they are at this point. So anyway, that's just my opinion. I could be wrong, and I'm always open to that.
Darcy, what do you think?
Well, I have a few things. One, we're talking about more than one type. We know there are some that are more aggressive than others. In all pretense and purposes, I'm coexisting with them because I know they're here. I don't seek them. They seek me. They let me know when they're around. I don't feed them. I don't try to draw attention to myself. And if they want you to know they're there, they're going to let you. If they don't want you to know, you're not going to know.
Yeah, that's very true.
But it comes down to which type you are dealing with.
It does. And I think if we were to learn, more about behaviors and their boundaries and things like that, learned how to, work around those things. A lot of animals have boundaries in their natural environments, and we know how to maneuver around those without, stirring the pot in a lot of cases, so to speak. Personally, I think that's, kind of the first step is learning how to behave around them correctly and not, cause a situation where, there's going to be aggravation, and then further bad things happening. So, like with most creatures, I think that's a starting point. But you're right. I mean, with the various types and all these things that are yet we don't know. And so it's pretty hard to predict that.
Well, look at it this way.
I want to jump in real.
Okay,
go ahead, Darcy.
Well, I was going to say, we have the grizzlies. Well, you have grizzlies out there. We have the black bear here. We have coyotes here. We have a lot of wild creatures here. And we know how to avoid them. It's just a matter of learning how to avoid Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. There are signs that they're out there if you learn to read the signs.
Right. And there are do's and don'ts. Yeah, there are do's and don'ts with all creatures. And if you learn those, you can learn how to coexist with them.
What I was going to say, and this is actually a good point, with boundaries.
Yeah.
Will, you and I both have a friend, Native American friend, and he talked about the boundaries that were established by his people, way back in the day, using, very primitive tools, primitive in the sense they didn't have firearms or anything like that. And basically what they did was they said, okay, this is our area, that's your area, and we don't cross these boundaries. And it's not just this gentleman that we have spoken with who said this. You just hear time and again where the Native Americans have set up areas where, okay, this is our spot, that is your spot. And okay, so if you have geographical boundaries, what other boundaries could be established? Boundaries such as behavioral boundaries, where you don't encroach on some behavior that they would find objectionable, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So if everybody, out there listening has thoughts, like I said, get a hold of us and give us your thoughts. We're interested in hearing. Well, we're just kind of doing an open forum here, questions, answers, discussion. Tom, do you have any questions, or Darcy, anything you want to bring up?
I do. I have a question. I really do. How much, and I know you've done a lot of research, Will, same with you, Tom, and I'm new at this for the last, 3.5 years. And what I've gathered with what I've seen and what I've heard and their actions, how much do we really know? I mean, it's bare minimal. And so when you try to do your research and you get more questions than answers, and there's really no help out there when you are dealing with them.
Right.
How much do we really know? I know when I hear something that it doesn't sound right to me from what I've observed.
Right. And the way
how much do we really know?
Well, to be honest, this subject is a quagmire. There's so much junk floating around out there. People come up with all sorts of ideas, that swag method, the scientific wild ass guess. Good information, some's based on just opinions or their feelings about something. I've done this for 48 years now, and I still have questions, probably more questions than answers. It's going to require a lot of intense work, even more than what I've done in the past in the field. And Tom and I are, we're going to be doing that here soon, but and providing a lot more answers, a lot more good answers based on direct observation. But it's everyone I've talked to that has come around to contacting me has said almost that exact thing you just said, Darcy. How they've waded through the gauntlet of junk out there, and they finally came around to us to ask these same questions. And I don't want to put people off or disparage anybody out there by not looking to see what's out there. People can listen to whoever they want to and believe what they want. But these sorts of things about the creatures, take a look at other large primate species and see if those things are similar to what other primates are like and what they're doing. And I think that's a pretty good gauge to start with.
Well, we were talking the other night, and and I'm thinking, I probably know about as much. And
I'd agree with that.
And I'm like, well, that's not what I've seen or observed. And I've seen a black, a dark blonde one. The red one scares me. Right. I have to tell you, the red one, it still bothers me.
And that one's actually the most typical coloring.
But the blonde one didn't. It amazed me. The blonde one did. The black one, it was aggressive because something was blocking its view while it was observing me. But the red one really unnerved me out of all of them. And I don't know if it's because it was on all fours and the mass of the body was huge. But I know what I've observed. They haven't really bothered me, but it depends on which type it is.
It does.
I would hate to come across a real aggressive one.
And there's a whole host of other things that could affect their behavior also, you know, different circumstance. So, I mean, you really can't tell until you kind of observe these things over a period of time to see, you know, what are their routines, what are their behaviors like, are they aggressive, are they less aggressive, more aggressive, why are they aggressive, you know, why are they there in the first place?
Well, you know, I've joked about the big blonde one, and I think it's more or less they know I live alone, and I'm more of a curiosity, but at the same time, I honestly believe the big one is watching out because he knows I live alone.
Have you had them? Yeah, have you had them do any other behaviors or any change in behaviors when other people have come to your home, like your nephew,
like
for instance?
I said, yeah, like with my nephew, they like if my son comes, it's not a big deal. It's like they know that that's mine. Now, my nephew, even though we're blood kin, they don't like him here. And that's when I get a lot of smacking on the house. Even though I got it before, and I think they're just letting me know, hey, we're out here. And I think it's the juvenile that does the smacking.
It's reasonable.
But when, obviously, I don't have men staying overnight and stuff, I don't think they would like it. Let's put it like that. Because it's out of the norm for me to have people over staying overnight.
You know, one thing I've noticed over the years observing, you know, behavior of these things in certain locations is if you change the routine much, they don't like it. If it stays kind of the same,
would be something different.
Right. If it stays kind of the same, then they'll continue doing kind of the same thing. But they don't like change.
No, and that's what I've noticed. If I'm here by myself, once in a while I get a big smack. I hear the whistling when they walk around the house, but when my nephew's here, it does ramp up. Why is that person here? You don't have many people here. It's like, why ain't he leaving? That type of thing. And, you know, that's something I observe. Not that they, like, want me. It's like they've adopted me and want to know why that person hasn't left. And that's the only way I can describe it to you.
Yeah, the circumstances are in a set way they found them, and they don't want that change. You get more people in the equation, and it's more of a threat to them.
Right. Other than that, they don't like change, and I don't change my routine that much.
Right, and that's unfortunately that's the way to keep them around. Is that maintaining
like
change?
I said, I don't go out seeking. Now, if I see evidence like the tree structures, I will take photos. But I actually do not go and seek and say, oh, are they outside? You know, I've walked out my front door and it's walking the tree line. Just like when I heard the samurai talking, or what I call gibberish, that night. I wasn't prepared for it because I was just shooting out my car to get my phone.
You know, that's interesting, that observation. I've heard that gibberish also, and I don't use the term samurai chatter because to me it didn't sound like that. It sounded like just gibberish.
Gibberish. That's what it's gibberish to me. And I thought, you know, nobody's going to believe this. I said, I'm not even trying to see them, and it happens. And unless you've heard that gibberishing, it's really unnerving.
It is. And actually, when I heard mine, and I only heard it the one time, the gibberish, there were two of them, and the other one was making chimp noises. And,
I didn't hear that. I heard the gibberish, and I could tell it was more than one, and it was probably 40 feet from where I was standing, trying to get to my car.
These were about 100 feet above where I was, or actually my buddies and I, we were camping, and you know, darndest thing I ever heard. One that was moving, kind of agitated, was making the chimp noises. The other one was just gibbering away.
But do you think it's a language?
Well, there's a lot of communication between creatures, so you have to look at the definition of language. The communication isn't necessarily language. You know what I mean? Because the noises, especially like with chimps and gorillas and other higher primates, are sort of group specific. You know what I mean? They can make the same range of noises, but the meanings for one group might be completely different for the next group, even though the noises are very similar.
Now, have you heard them click before?
It's funny. There are a lot of noises I've heard over the years and never really thought about it until recent years, listening to other people talk about these things.
Because
So
I've heard them like click.
Now-
Like.
Do you think it's a tongue
Like
pop?
that.
A tongue pop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's much more common than people realize. They call things, even wood knocks and things. I don't think they're necessarily wood knocks. I think they're tongue pops.
So it's not just me that's heard it then.
Oh, no. Quite a few people. Tom,
Okay.
we've talked to quite a few people who have said that.
Oh yeah. We've and again, a mutual acquaintance of ours has heard it. That one time last summer when a bunch of us were out, very clearly heard it.
Because when I
So
was hearing
and he said
gibbering-
it's not quite we're talking about the tongue pops, and it wasn't wood knocking. I imagine they have the ability to really project a loud sound with a lot of volume behind it.
I suspect, too, that a lot of times when people are hearing odd noises like that, you have to think in terms of, like, food preparation. What if they've got something in there, smacking it or whatever it is they're doing to be able to better eat it? You know what I'm saying?
Well, I was thinking it was more like communication because that's what I was hearing with the gibbering that night.
Well, the tongue pops, I think they're doing that a lot of times when they're coordinating hunting. It's not something necessarily, the prey is going to be aware of. They might hear it, but they're not going to be spooked by it, possibly. But it's a way to coordinate with one another in movements.
I don't want to be the prey.
No, you don't want to be the ham sandwich. Don't do that, Darcy.
No. Because that's what I was hearing that night, and I'm thinking, oh, no.
Now,
But when I do walk out at night, I do look.
Also,
because I'm very much aware that they are around.
Right. The way they're moving around your home might also be a coordinated way of moving, so you might hear those noises there also.
Oh, yeah. Like I said, I don't know what it is. I don't feel threatened. Now, the red one bothers me, but the blonde one never has.
Darcy, what is it about the red one, besides being on all fours? Is it that it's bulky, or was there just this sense or a feeling that you got around it?
I think it's all the above. I guess because I wasn't expecting to see it in my rearview mirror. And then when I saw it, it was just massive. I knew it wasn't a bear, a black bear, or what we call a black bear. It can be different colors. The hair was way too long on it. It was shaggy. I can go and do a color swatch because I do hair, and I can match the color of what I saw. I'm just telling you, this thing, the body on this thing was massive. And the way it moved, I mean, it was booking. Had I not looked up, I probably wouldn't have seen it.
Wow.
And
we had...
It's huge.
Go ahead, Darcy.
It was just massive.
Yeah.
I don't know what that particular one, it just, in my mind, I knew I was in danger. That's how I felt. Even though I was moving away from it.
Yeah.
And I was in my car, it didn't matter. That thing scared me.
Yes.
And the blonde one that ran by my house, the first sighting, well, but 35 feet from me, and it didn't scare me.
Well, and the physiology is different, isn't it? I think it's muscular, but it's not big and beefy and bulky, right?
This the red one, I couldn't see like the muscle mass because it was on all four, but it was huge and the hair was long. The dark blonde one, I could see every muscle in its shoulder blades down all the way to its gluteus maximus, the thighs, everything, because the hair was shorter and it was lighter, so I could really make out the muscle mass. This was just a massive, huge creature with long hair, and to me, the way it was moving, it just shocked me. I can't begin to tell you how big this thing was on all fours. I drive a HHR, and to me, on all fours, it was about as big up and as high as the HHR is. That's how big it was.
Well, that sounds like it was probably, I'm just going out on a limb here, but it really sounds like what Darcy has is a different type, the blonde one and the black one. But the red one sounds like it's probably a type 1.
It could be. It could be type 2 also. That reminds me, of the size on all fours. Remember my talking about interviewing a canine officer years ago, and he and his partner, this was in Texas, and they were en route to two cruisers, one guy in each one, and each one had their dog, and they were en route to another, deputy sheriff, so they were in a county, so they were heading from one community to another one. They said they were doing a pretty good clip. This was at night, and one of these creatures came charging at, I believe it was the lead vehicle, on all fours, kind of diagonally across this big open area, and actually paced the cruiser for a bit. And he said it was huge. It was on all fours, and he looked out, and of course the dogs in both vehicles were going crazy, which, canine dogs typically don't behave like that because they're training. But he said the thing was massive, and it paced him for a few moments and then veered off. But it sounds about like the same description you mentioned in height and size.
Well, you know what a HHR looks like.
Yes.
Okay. To me, if it had been right beside me, it would have been way above my hood on all fours. Easy.
And Tom, remember the story of the TW told us about the 15-year-old boy in West Texas who, the creature, he was riding his bike home, and then the thing, had the feeling he was being watched, and he stopped under the first street light and looked behind him, and here was this massive creature that was on all fours, and he said it was about 6 feet high on all fours.
Yeah.
That's what I meant by body mass.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think that's what unnerved me, because all I could think of is, how big is that thing if it stands up? I mean, because the body mass to me was wide.
Right.
I mean, it really unnerved me.
Well, we talked to that lady she was around Carson. She was driving up around Carson and saw one go across the road on all fours, and then it stood up. And that kind of rattled her. Yeah,
she thought it was a bear at first. Well, she saw its backside sticking up and thought it was a bear until it stood up and walked off, and it was silhouetted. She was coming up to a T intersection through the timber, and then the intersection ahead was open beyond that. So she got this beautiful silhouette of this thing, took a couple steps across the road and was gone.
Well, let me just tell you, the gait of this thing is not like a gait of a bear on all fours. They're not moving.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes.
And that's why I knew it wasn't a bear. It was just too large, and the gait wasn't the same. And believe me, growing up in North Carolina, you see bears. I've been in the mountains. I've seen them go into the garbage cans and stuff while we were up there visiting. I've seen them here in this area, in Cary, believe it or not. At Cary Parkway, there's a walk place, and there's bears there. You see the footprints. So I know what I saw. I wished I could describe just what I was looking at. And
I want to... I'm sorry. I just wanted to make a real quick point for the skeptics that want to say, they're really grasping at straws. They say, well, you really saw a bear walking on two legs. And I want to reply and say, I want to talk about what you saw and about what this lady in Carson saw. And so many other people have seen. A friend of mine saw one on all fours. And the simplest answer is, and it sounds kind of overstated, but it's true, and that is, do you know why it didn't look like a bear? Because it's not a bear. That's the simplest answer.
Yeah.
It isn't. It's a Bigfoot. It is what it is. It's not a bear. Let's move on.
Yeah, there's just no comparison. Because when you're looking at it from behind and you see the shoulders from one end to the next, and it's 4.5, 5 feet wide. And you can see the muscles moving at the shoulder blades and everything. And then you go down and you see the gluteus maximus muscles. It's not a bear. Bears don't have that. And then the muscles on the legs. I'm sorry. No.
I've seen black bear, yeah. And when they stand on all or on two legs, they just don't look. I can't imagine anybody, even somebody who's unfamiliar with wildlife, confusing that.
Okay, their rear end looks flat when they stand up. Okay, that's the best way I can describe it to you. Okay.
Bears have ears. They got a nose. They got a snout. No, it wasn't a bear.
No, but I think that's the mass of how big the girth and everything. With the red ones, it's why that's the one that bothers me.
Yes.
Because I can compare it to my car.
It's funny because there's so many people who have had encounters, and here in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of them, not all of them, but certainly a large percentage of them are the red ones. And they're just very shocking. I haven't talked to anybody who's had a face-to-face or close-up encounter with one who said, that was just the most wonderful experience. I can't wait to do that again. It's usually, they're pretty unnerved by the entire experience.
Like I said, I was in more, I guess, awe when I saw the blonde one. But then again, it took a while for my brain to process what I had seen. It wasn't like, there's a Bigfoot. I wasn't expecting it. At no point did I ever think I was going to walk out and see one. Not even that morning, I wasn't even thinking of it. Yeah. And I've told people this, if I don't ever see another one, I'm okay. Because it's affected me that much. I don't go hiking no more. I won't go camping no more. I used to do nature photography. I don't even do any of that anymore.
Right.
And I'm okay with that.
I know the feeling. All those things that you just listed, I still do, but I do it with a lot more caution, and I won't do it alone anymore. For that reason.
And I used to go out alone with my camera and take photo after photo after photo.
Yeah.
And I won't do it now. Even if I went with a group of people, I would have to be in the center. I couldn't be front, back. It just wouldn't be the same.
Right.
And do I miss it? Yes, but when you know something's really out there, you just have to think twice. Is it really worth it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I just love the woods. I'm just speaking for myself. I mean, I love the outdoors
I love gardening.
too much.
I love to garden. I love the woods. I grew up, there were 7 of us, and the 2 closest to me in age were boys. We used to build forts outside. I mean, I've always been outside. And now I'm like, I'm lucky if I go sit outside in the morning when it's light to drink my coffee now.
Right.
But I do it. I still do it. I won't do it at night if I'm by myself, though.
Sure.
That's just not going to happen. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
I make sure if I have anything in my car, I make sure I get it when I come in. I'm not going back outside. Unless it's an emergency, I don't go back outside. No. Just like coming in tonight, I made sure I had everything because I knew I wasn't going back outside.
Right. You know, now your nephew smelled that foul odor. And
Oh, yes.
I'm assuming you smelled it as well. Is that right?
Right. When I first moved here, I think I told you this in an interview. When I first moved here, I heard the growl, the deep guttural primal howls, how I describe it, that made me vibrate from the inside out. Still, I didn't think Bigfoot.
Right.
I would go out early in the morning, right after the sun come up, and I would be drinking my coffee, and I thought it was my septic tank that had messed up. They even come and checked it out because the lingering smell was still there. But I didn't know the creatures were around. I still won't thinking it. After the growl, the smell, I didn't put two and two together. It's until I finally saw it run by my house. That's how I said, oh, so that's what that smell was. Even though the one that ran by the house did not leave a smell. They don't all smell.
Mm-hmm. No, they don't. And then even the ones that do, I don't think they always smell. And one thing I really want to point out that you bring up, and that is you had a pretty good amount of evidence without a sighting prior to the sighting of these creatures. And that's really important from a not only a behavioral standpoint, but just from a standpoint of validity that they're there. And the reason is, and this is what I tell people, time and again, we hear people saying, well, I didn't see one, but here's what I did experience. You know, they heard the sounds, they smelled the smells, they saw the footprints, all these things. They're like, but I didn't have a sighting, as if they're somehow deficit in their encounter for not having a sighting. I'm like, well, you know, if you're sailing a boat or a ship in the North Atlantic and all you see is a little piece of ice up on the surface, it represents a much larger reality below that, which is an iceberg. You know, Can we say Titanic? So you had all these bits of information, pieces of the puzzle, and you put them together. Guess what? You end up with a Sasquatch.
And like I said, I always believed in the possibility. But did I ever think or ever dream that I would see one? No, I wasn't seeking to see one. Now, I believe I told you, Will, that I had a customer in my chair that lives about 2 miles down the road, and I was telling him about it. Now, he has heard sounds. He's not seen one, he said, but he's heard stuff that he could not place, and he's a woodsman. He loves going out in the woods, hunting and stuff, but he said he's heard stuff that he could not place.
Yeah, that's a real clue there, isn't it? When somebody's, been in an area all their lives and are pretty familiar with all the sounds, and then they hear something they're totally unfamiliar with.
Yes, and he says, you really had, I said, I've had several sightings in the last 3.5 years. And so there's people around here that have either heard them, they haven't seen them, they don't want to say it is, like my nephew. But now, like I said, my nephew hasn't been back in over a week. So it's enough to, yeah. I just wish we had more information. And I wish we could get the information out of what we do know to people and let them realize that, yes, these creatures are real.
Tom, you were going to mention some questions earlier.
Yeah, well, one of the questions I have, I just want to go back to your Darcy, your nephew, real quick. Did he specifically come out and say, this is why I haven't been out at your place?
No, he hasn't. He hasn't said anything. I called him the other night. He says, oh, I'm just taking care of some stuff in Greensboro, but you work in Raleigh. So he's just avoiding it. That's just him.
Wow. Yeah.
But that smell was horrible.
Yeah, I've only smelled it one time, and it's pretty bad. And to me, it seemed like more than it's not just a nasty smell. It's almost like it's an aggressive, maybe an assault or a warning or a challenge. I don't know. There's a reason that smell comes out, and it's
Well, like
I think they're communicating.
I thought it was my septic tank.
Right.
Because it was a lingering odor. But whether it was close by or I just missed it when I went out, but it was enough that we had to check the septic tank. But it would only be in the morning, not in the evening, not in the hot sun. It would be just early in the morning. I could smell it.
Yeah. Well, that brings up a question. I've asked it before, but I'm going to ask it again. And we may or may not have a definitive answer, but what do you think? Two questions. One, what do you think the smell is, and why do they do it? How do they do it, and why do they do it?
Well, it's most likely scent glands.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Higher primates like gorillas have them. And it's usually when they get excited or, upset about something.
Yeah. That's what I've always said.
Well, the reason I asked is it almost feels like at times it's projected.
It's either that or a defense mechanism. Because who's going to go to something that really stinks real bad? You're going to avoid it.
Very good point. Yeah, absolutely.
I know I am.
Right. It just the one encounter that I experienced, it felt like it was like we were being targeted with that smell. And it could be that we just simply rattled its cage with our presence, and it blinked, so to speak. It reacted.
Yeah, that's most likely what was going on.
Well,
I just want to mention also, Darcy, I'm just looking at, and we're not going to give your location away, but I'm just looking at it on Google Earth here, and within 2 miles, I mean, there's something that Will and I have talked about, near your house, which is something that would be attractive to them. Plus, there's some water sources. So, and you're in an area where there must be a fair amount of. They've got some concealment, which I think is very important to the creatures. So I don't think they're really landlocked.
There is a lot of concealment around here. There's woods after woods after woods. There's a lot of game lands. I've got the Hall River. I've got the Deep River. I've got Jordan Lake not far. It's just, you have to see where I'm located. Everybody says, well, there's a subdivision, just right beside me. Well, it's not really right beside me, and it's not a big subdivision, but I am in this little nook with trees surrounding me, and there's not that many homes around where I'm at.
No, there isn't. And I got to say, Will, we've talked to several people, a couple of them on the air just recently. This area in North Carolina is just absolutely very, very active with these creatures.
Yeah,
I talked to Scott Sunday, and we had a good conversation. I did. About, he showed me some footprints and stuff, and we were just talking. And he said eventually he would love to put out a recorder here. And I said, by all means, not right anytime soon once we get to know and everything. And I would love to be able to walk the riverbank where he did and to see what I would see. That kind of thing. We discussed that. But he's only about 25 minutes from where I live. 35 minutes. It depends on which route you take. It could be more.
Sure. That's pretty close.
Well, I'm only about an hour away from Ury Park, also, in Montgomery County. So,
gotcha.
And, of course, they've had sightings in Sanford, North Carolina. And that's like 15, 20 minutes from here.
And which part of North Carolina was that again?
In Sanford.
Oh, Sanford. Okay, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and, looking at again, just talking about Scott and the footprints that he found, they're absolutely astonishing. There's little ones, there's big ones. There's just a huge, like a community of these things. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're not actually connected to the ones that you're seeing.
Well, that's what I think. I think they do migrate a little bit. They have, like, certain areas they go to at different times of year.
Have you seen anything along the lines that would suggest that there is there any kind of fruit trees or any sort of food source that you know of in your proximity to your house that they would be interested in?
I'm going to go back to the bamboo. Even humans can eat some part of the bamboo or use it. I mean, think about bamboo shoots and stuff that we eat in Chinese food. Why wouldn't they eat it? It's very nutritious. And that's all my backyard is bamboo.
And
it has thinned out a lot since I've been here.
Well, and the bamboo that you have in your yard, it's the big, there's different kinds. There's the real small diameter, and I think the stuff that you have, isn't it the large diameter bamboo?
Yes. But if you catch it when it's just sprouting up, it's small. And you can get a lot of nourishment from it.
Yeah.
So
have you seen?
You ask them, I have to say, yeah, they're cool.
Yeah.
I was going to
do
do my
the obvious question is,
and I didn't.
And your garden.
Right. I didn't do the garden because I thought, well, what's the point? To me, it's free food, and it may attract them more.
Sure.
So I didn't.
Have you seen any evidence that they've eaten the bamboo or nibbled on it?
Yeah. I've seen it where it's
you have?
snapped. Oh, yes. And we're not talking about midway. We're talking about up high. And at one point, I had some crisscross real high up in the air. But that's before I actually saw one, and I didn't know what I was looking at. So, yeah, do I think they could eat the bamboo? Most definitely.
Well,
there's plenty back
and maybe
there.
It may have an appeal to them. Sure. It's
I know
it's roughage if nothing else.
Right. Behind me, way back there, I know there's a farmer back there because I hear the donkey, the chickens, the rooster and stuff. But he's not right up on me. And that's where the creature was running from, coming from that direction, coming towards my house, the first one I saw.
Okay.
So there's plenty here. There's a lot of wildlife here.
I think I'm looking at that farmhouse right now. And there's a lot of woods between you and the farmer.
Yep.
And that's coming from the direction of there's a feature in the land. We can talk about it off the air that I think they would be very interested in. Will and I have talked about it. And plus, not too far from there, there's a lot of water sources. You got a lot of creeks and rivers that sort of thing.
But I even allowed Scott to see where I'm located at. And he said, oh, my God. He was shocked about what's actually around where I live at. And like I said, I've got the power lines right there. You've seen them from Google. I mean, they're right here.
And for our listeners, that was Scott we had on the previous episode last week.
So, yeah, it's interesting, but I don't leave my trash out. I take it to the dump daily, if that tells you anything. I leave nothing out to attract. So,
no, that's a good point.
I don't encourage them, you know, by no means.
Well, you had a situation that you had somebody that you knew that we both know here in Oregon go and advise a family on what to do to get the creatures out of off their property. And part of it was cutting down the trees, and part of it was getting rid of the trash around their house. But unfortunately, they heeded that advice for only just a little small amount of time, and that went back to storing the trash around the house.
You need, if you have them around your property and you don't want them there, they're causing problems, you need to have at least the brush, bushes, things like that, cut back at least 50 feet away from your house, because they like to use that for cover. They don't like to be out in the open.
Right.
So that's one of the things. And yeah, this family was having a lot of problems. They were coming up looking at small children in the windows and causing, I mean, the behavior was ramping up, and it wasn't good. They were quite scared. So, but the man of the house decided that about a year later that he wanted to entice them back. So he was piling up his garbage in the back of the house. And yeah, that was not a good situation. We'd gotten rid of him, and here he was trying to bring him back. Yeah, for whatever reason.
Well,
I don't know.
You know, Will, I cook a lot. You know I do, because you see my photos when I put up.
Right.
And I open up my window when I'm cooking, and I'm thinking, how dumb is that? You know, they have to smell what I'm cooking.
Well,
and those two times, those two times that it actually come up to the window, I had cooked that night, and the smell must have still been lingering, because it was like 2 in the morning when they walked up, because it was late. Because I was on the computer late. I was writing. And I'm thinking, that's what had to attract them. Not the fact that I was in the kitchen, but I had been cooking.
Most likely, sure.
Well, Darcy, what were you cooking? I'm curious.
I cook a little bit of everything.
She does, and some very good stuff.
Any apple pie?
I make blackberry pound cake the other week.
I tell you what, I see the blackberry stuff she makes, and I start drooling because that's my favorite.
And I make cobblers, banana puddings, and I'm always cooking a lot of southern dishes like gumbo and all that. So it could be a variety of stuff. I bake bread a lot. Just say that if it's cooking, it's smelling good, and if I have that window open, that's why they walked up. I had to give myself, I'm thinking, what would it attract them to walk up? And it's because I do a lot of cooking. And I do open that
I think the mystery is solved.
You're right.
But
well, it would have me wandering around the window. I mean...
I would let you come in and eat, okay? But really, it really is. I had to really give it a lot of thought because I have a small kitchen, and it gets really hot, so I opened up the window.
Oh, sure. No, it makes sense.
And I'm thinking, I'm on my computer, and I thought maybe they were just trying to figure out what I was doing, and it really dawned on me. I cook a lot. And that's what really attracted them, I think, those 2 times that it comes to my window.
Yeah, very likely. It's things that most people don't think about until afterwards, and it's like, oh, maybe this is why this happened.
Oh, yeah. And yeah, I cook every day. There's something always brewing on my stove.
Well, it's interesting, all the activity in that region, and we're finding more and more, it seems like. So
There's a lot of people, they're just not coming forward, and they're not going to.
Right. I think that's very common.
Stigmatism. And to me, I'm like, I could care less. I talk about it at work. Anybody wants any questions? I've got plenty of photos of the tree structures, the tree breaks and stuff. So it doesn't bother me at all what people think.
Right, and that's a good point. Well, listen, Darcy and Tom, we're just about out of time. So any final thoughts or anything from either one of you? Crickets. I know that's a tough question, right?
I enjoyed the questions and the answers that I got tonight. I just wish more people would take the initiative and really realize that, look, they're here. They're not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. And Tom? I think they're more heavily populated than we think.
Yeah, much more so. Tom, anything for you?
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. I was very interested with Darcy when I found out you were going to be on. And I got to tell you, North Carolina is really a fascinating place from the standpoint of these creatures.
Well, if you look at it, there's a lot of rural areas. And, even if it's farmland, there's nobody around while they're walking on the farm. Mm-hmm. They can go from acre to acre, and there's only one or two farmers that are probably farming and doing the field at a time. They're not going to see them. So even if it's not,
what's interesting is there are other places just like that. I mean, even the area I grew up in, Washington. Other than myself, maybe a handful, not even a handful. I only knew one other guy my age lived over the hill from us. Were out in the pastures doing anything, and our neighbors across the street, they'd be out occasionally in their fields, but other than that, not a whole lot. And the same elsewhere. We talked about the Yakult thing that I investigated years ago, and there was nobody in those fields. So I think they kind of pick locations where there isn't a lot of human activity. They probably watch those areas, from a distance, and kind of gauge what's going on. And
they can go from point A to point B easy.
Sure they can. And it's easy pickings for food.
Yeah. Very, very easy. And when you look at it from that standpoint, they don't always have to have woods.
No,
if there's a big expanse of land and there's not a lot of people, they can have a heyday.
And as we found out, right, as we found out in, with Kansas and areas like that, we've got a couple of good friends there who had encounters in places like that, and I would have never considered that before. But there they were.
Oh, yeah. So it's not always the norm. I think sometimes they acclimate to whatever area they're in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, listen, guys. Darcy, you're going to have to absolutely come back. And keep us posted as to what's going on there.
But I thought it was cute about my nephew.
You got a kick out of that.
I mean, I hadn't seen hide nor hair of him since then.
That's interesting.
And I'm like, because I love having him here. I mean,
sure.
One, I'm not alone, but two, I just love my nephew, and he's great company, and I get to cook for somebody.
Right,
so,
there you go.
Yeah, so, but he's not here. Oh, well, maybe he'll come back.
Well, let's hope so.
I do, I hope so. But y'all have a good evening, and thank you for talking, and I enjoyed it.
All right, Darcy, it's always a pleasure having you on here.
Thank you, Darcy.
All right, have a good evening. Bye, Tom.
Bye-bye.
The Denna people liked him, Tex Cobb. No sentiment was wasted on either side, but he and the tribesmen had a live and let live understanding that was rare in those days. He stayed off their trap lines, and they stayed off his. If an Indian had a salmon net and an eddy, Texas found another eddy, and vice versa. Due to the fact that the Indians trusted him, we became involved with what today would be called, I suppose, an abominable snowman. I have since heard and read a great deal about the abominable snowman. I have seen the photographs of those tracks in the snow on a Tibetan mountain, and to me, they are simply the tracks of a man with gunny sack or some cloth wrapped around his feet as protection from the cold, climbing slewfoot because the slope was steep and he had no crampons. But when I was a youngster roaming the north with Tex, we had never heard of the abominable snowman. We had, however, heard much about Gilyuk, the shaggy cannibal giant, sometimes called the big man with a little hat. Our adventure with Gilyuk occurred while we were camped in a pretty spruce park on Yellow Jacket Creek, south of Tyrone Lake. We had spent the entire summer on this mountain, girt Nelchina Plateau, wandering about in aimless nomad fashion. Tex said we were prospecting and looking for fur sign. Maybe we were. He always had to have an excuse for enjoying the country, a commercial excuse if he could think of one. Anyway, it was now late September, the beautiful time, no mosquitoes, the land ablaze with color, the fish and the meat animals summer fat, the caribou horde gathering, and we were footloose and free as perhaps men can never be again. This morning, Tex was making coffee, and I was down at the creek clearing a mess of grayling for breakfast, when 6 Indians filed through the timber. They stood for a moment, solemnly regarding our 4 horses. To them, a horse was a rarity, a mysterious animal. They called them McKinley moose because McKinley was the only president they had ever heard of, and the horses were as big as moose. I followed them to the camp. "Have you eaten?" Tex asked them in Denna. They said they had eaten. Chief Stickman was with them. I had seen him once before, at Eklunta village. A squat, square-faced man, very dark, with long hair and quick-moving obsidian eyes. He was the Denna boss of this entire area, and his reputation was bad. But now, he had trouble that he couldn't handle. He told us about it, and as he talked, he kept standing first on one leg, then the other, balancing himself with the moccasined sole of the free foot against the knee of the supporting leg. I don't know whether it was habit or a medicine trick to ward off evil spirits or both, but it was disconcerting. He had come into this area 2 days ago, he said, with some of his people to kill and cache caribou for winter use. But they had discovered that Gilyuk, the shaggy giant, was hanging around. They found his sign yesterday, and of course everybody knew that Gilyuk wasn't interested in caribou. Gilyuk ate men. "What kind of sign?" Tex asked. "We will take you to see it," Stickman said. "It's not far." After breakfast, we followed the Indians upstream a couple of miles to a burned flat on which a nurse crop of aspen and birch had grown. In the center of the flat stood a ruined birch sapling. It had been about 4 inches through and maybe 10 feet tall. Something had twisted the sapling, as a man would twist a matchstick. The wood had separated into individual fibers. The bark hung in tatters. Stickman and his hunters stood back, while Tex and I looked the site over. Moose often ride a sapling down to get at the tender upper twigs. So do caribou. But no moose or caribou had done this. This had been done by something with hands. It had happened yesterday, because the leaves of the sapling had not yet completely wilted. It wasn't the work of lightning. No burns. A freak whirlwind hadn't done it, because trees and brush a few yards distant were undamaged. The hard ground showed no tracks. We found no snagged hair on the brush. Absolutely nothing, except the incredibly twisted birch sapling. It was, without question, the eeriest sight I have ever beheld in the wilds. Stickman said, "It is Gilyuk's mark. We have seen it before." I wish to make clear that to the Denna people, Gilyuk was no legendary creature their grandfathers had told them about. He was a reality, and they spoke of him as they spoke of bears and wolves. They saw his sign, and they saw him. He was a shaggy giant who wore a little hat and ate men. "We want to ask you to camp with us until we have killed our caribou," Stickman said. "Gilyuk doesn't molest white men. Perhaps he will not molest us if you are in the camp." Stickman had already told us that he was bivouacked on the shore of a pothole lake 2 hours to the eastward. Tex said all right, we would move to his camp in the morning. As he was still looking at the twisted sapling, his green eyes narrowed in thought. I couldn't take my gaze off of it either. Stickman said, "Thanks, Kosaki," a strange word of respect held over from the old Russian Cossack, and we parted company with the Indians. Next morning, I brought the horses in at daybreak. We ate, broke camp, and were putting on the packs when here came the Indians. All of them. All, that is, except Stickman. An old man told us Stickman was dead. Gilyuk had taken him. The chief had got up in the night and gone down to the lake, perhaps for water, but nobody knew. A squaw with a birch bark torch found his red flannel underwear on the gravel beach. It had been torn off of him. There may have been tracks, but the entire hunting party had swarmed over the beach, and by daylight no tracker on earth could have made sense of the jumble. Well, until the day of his own death last July, while on a sentimental journey to a fateful spot in Cook Inlet, Tex was convinced that the cannibal giant Gilyuk killed Stickman. When asked if he believed in the existence of abominable snowmen, Tex would reply that he didn't think there were any around in Alaska nowadays, but that they had existed, at least one of them, a couple of decades back.
Welcome. This story is being brought to you by William Jevning and is being narrated by me, Jim Sower. The name of this story, Two Tales of the Yeho. Curious Legend of the Kentucky Mountains, 4 or 5 versions of this curious and strange legend, come into my collection over a period of about 6 years, 1948 to 1954, from an isolated region of the Kentucky Mountains. At first I did not know what to make of it, but having also collected a few versions of The Bear's Son, story minus the half-bear, half-man introduction, I guessed that this was the introduction now broken away and told separately. It now appears to be a distinct legend, since Dr. Archer Taylor refers me to the long search for American versions by Mr. Rudolph Atrocci. And now that I reflect on this item, I realize that it is not unique to Kentucky mountain folklore. During my youth in these mountains, it was not unusual to hear a rumor of some half-wild man, naked and hairy, being found in the woods, living close to animal state. This kind of Romulus Remus legend seems to stick in the minds of the folk, but how this particular legend made its way into eastern Kentucky is a mystery to me. The following version was taken down in pencil in 1950 from the lips of Lee Maggard, who lived in a small cabin on the south slope of the Pine Mountain Range near the small lumber town of Putney, Harlan County, Kentucky. He had heard it on Maggard's branch, Leslie County, Kentucky. The Yeho. Once there was man out hunting. He got lost, and after a while he began to get hungry. He came to a big hole in the ground, and he thought he would venture down into it. He went down in there, and he found that the old Yeho lived in there. There was deer meat hanging up, and other food piled around the walls. The man was afraid at first, but Yeho didn't bother him, and he went toward that meat to get him some. The Yeho walked over and looked at the knife and said, "Yeho, Yeho," a time or two. He cut it off a piece of the meat, and he started eating it. Well, the man stepped over to the middle of the pit and took out his flint and built him up a fire. And the Yeho watched him and looked at the fire and at the flint and said, "Yeho, Yeho," again. The man put his meat on a stick and briled him a nice piece and started eating it. The Yale watched him and acted like he wanted a piece. The man cut it off a piece of the briled meat and reached it over, and the Yale commenced to eating it up and smacking its lips and saying, Yale, Yale. Well, the man lived there with it a long time, and they got along all right. After so long, there was a young'un born to him, and it was half man and half Yeho. And the Yeho took such a liking to the man, it wouldn't let him leave. He got to wanting to get away and go back home. One day, he slipped off and the Yeho followed him and made him go back. Went on that way for a good while, but he picked him a good time and slipped away. This time he got to the shore where there was a ship ready to sail. He got on the ship, and he looked, and he saw the Yeho coming with a young'un. It screamed and hollered for him to come back, and when it saw he wasn't going to come, why, it just tore the baby in two and held it out, one half to him, and said, Yeho, Yeho! He sailed on off and left it standing there. The version that Dr. Taylor refers to in my book, South from Hell for Sartin, is called The Origin of Man. Another version was given to me by this teller's grandson. It has the same title and contents, except that the Yeho has 6 children and tears them all in two and throws them after the embarked man. Another text, similar to the one given above, was accidentally erased from my tapes. The following text was recorded from Joe Couch, Appalachia, Virginia, in 1954. He had heard it from his people while he lived in Perry County, Kentucky. The Hairy Woman. One time I was prowling in the wilderness, wandering about, kindly got lost, and so weak and hungry I couldn't go. When it began to get cool, I found a big cave and crawled back in there to get warm. Crawled back in and come upon a leaf bed, and I dozed off to sleep. I heard an awful racket coming into that cave, and something come in and crawled right over me and laid down like a big old bear. It was a hairy thing, and when it laid down, it went chomp, chomp, chawing on something. I thought to myself, I'll see what it is and find out what it's eating. I reached over, and a hairy-like woman was there eating chestnuts. Had about a half a bushel there. I got me a big handful of them and went to chewing on them too. Well, in a few minutes, she handed me over another big handful, and I eat chestnuts until I was kindly full and wasn't hungry any more. Directly, she got up and took off and out of sight. Well, I stayed on there till next morning, and she come in with a young deer. Brought it in, and with her big long fingernails she ripped its hide and skinned it, and then she sliced the good lean meat and handed me a bite to eat. I kindly slipped it behind me, afraid to eat it raw and afraid not to eat it, being she give it to me. She'd cut off big pieces of deer meat and eat it raw. Well, I laid back, and the other pieces she give me over as she eaten hers. She was going to see that I didn't starve. When she got gone again, I built up a little fire and briled my meat. After being hungry for 2 or 3 days, it was good cooked. Yes, buddy. She come in while I had a fire. She come in while I had my fire built, briling my meat, and she run right into that fire. She couldn't understand because it kindly burnt her a little. She jumped back and looked at me like she was going to run through me. I said, uh-oh, I'm going to get in trouble now. Well, it was cold and bad out, so I just stayed another night with her. She was a woman, but was right hairy all over. After several days, I learned her how to brile meat, and that fire would burn her. She got shy of the fire, and got so she liked briled meat and wouldn't eat it raw any more. We went on through the winter that way. She would go out and carry in deer and bear. So I lived there about 2 years, and when we had a little kid, one side of it was hairy and the other side was slick. I took a notion I'd leave there and go back home. I began to build me a boat to go away across the lake in. One time after I had left, I took a notion I'd slip back and see what she was doing. I went out to the edge of the cliff and looked down into the mountain, and it looked like 2 or 3 dozen of hairy people coming up the hill. They were all pressing her, and she would push them back. They wanted to come on up and come in. I was scared to death, afraid they was going to kill me. She made them go back and wouldn't let them come up and interfere. Well, I took a notion to leave one day when my boat was ready. I told her one day I was going to leave. She followed me down to my boat and watched me get ready to go away. She was crying, wanting me to stay. I said, "No, I'm tired of the jungles. I'm going back to civilization again, going back." When she knowed she wasn't going to keep me there, she just grabbed the little one and tore it right open with her nails, throwed me the hairy part, and she kept the slick side. That's the end of that story. This is the end of the story. Thank you for listening. Welcome. This is a collection of 3 stories being brought to you by William Jevning and being narrated by me, Jim Sower. Story number 1. Many Names, Alaska's Bigfoot, 1994. Alaska's Bigfoot. Bigfoot has been reported in several parts of Alaska. The Tlingit Indians of southeastern Alaska call it Kushtaka. The Denina Indians of south-central named it Nint'ina. The Eskimos of southwest Alaska call it Ureuli, or hairy man. John Active, a Yupik storyteller from Bethel, has gathered a large number of accounts told by the Yupik people of southwestern Alaska concerning their encounters with Ureuli. This being was described as standing 10 feet tall, covered with hair, with glowing eyes. Its arms were so long they reached to the creature's ankles. It was said to roam the tundra and cry out its loneliness with a voice resembling that of a loon. Although its appearance terrified the persons confronting it, the Ureuli never harmed anyone, according to the accounts gathered by John Active. However, legendary accounts lore has it that children who disappear while in the woods are transformed into Ureuli. The southeastern Kushtaka has a less benevolent reputation. The natives feared the creature and avoided its habitat. Harry D. Culp described a miner's encounter with the Kushtaka in an account which was later published as The Strangest Story Ever Told. Culp and 3 other prospectors teamed up in 1900 at Wrangell. They sent Charlie, one of the 4, to Thomas Bay to look over a gold prospect, while the others sought grub stakes to pay their expenses. Charlie went about 50 miles up the coast to this location. There, the rains kept him confined to his tent for several days. He then went out, trying to locate the landmarks given to him by an Indian. By chance, he found a gold-flecked quartz ledge and loosened a piece with his gun, breaking his gun stock in the process. As he was taking his bearings, he said, a troop of creatures he called devils that looked like both men and monkeys swarmed after him. These shaggy beasts with long, coarse hair, stinking and covered with sores, pursued him back to his canoe. During the chase, they screamed and scraped his back with long, claw-like fingers. Charlie said he came to in his canoe, which was drifting at sea. He was cold, hungry, and thirsty. He returned to his comrades with nothing but the clothes on his back, his canoe and oars, and the chunk of gold quartz. He declared he had enough of Alaska. In exchange for his passage back to Seattle, he told his tale to the other three. Two more of Culp's partners returned to the site of the gold-speckled quartz ledge. Once again, they returned with strange tales of devils. One of the partners was said to have gone mad. Other prospects who have scouted the same area were reported by Culp to have suffered frightening experiences and to have behaved in a strange manner afterwards. Mysterious happenings occurred as late as 1925, when a farmer reported losing a dog in the hills there, but finding strange tracks, with the hind feet resembling a cross between a bear's and a human's footprints. A trapper in the area disappeared. Searchers found his outfit and tracks, but no trace of the man. The Iliamna region not only has a fish monster, but also is a home to Big Man, as the natives call him there. For years, Big Man has been blamed for stealing fish from the villages and for mysterious disappearances of people. More recently, Federal Aviation Administration worker Jim Coffey said an 8-foot humanoid almost ran him off the road in New Halen near Lake Iliamna. That same night, a woman living nearby reported that a Bigfoot left watermelon-sized footprints in her yard and tore down her laundry. Investigators found huge footprints alongside the road. At 24 inches long, they were the largest Bigfoot prints ever found. That's the end of story number 1. Story number 2. Expedition sets out to find unknown creature. The Ucumar? March 2nd, 2003. Expedition sets out to find unknown creature. Mitan, Argentina. Police, backwoodsmen, and firemen seek out strange animal. Rosario de la Frontera footprints found, and strange howls heard. Reinforced by personnel from Mitan, the research team is trying to lock down a wooded area. A team composed of over 20 policemen from Rosario de la Frontera and Mitan, some 15 mounted backwoodsmen, 12 members of the Ciudad Terminal Volunteer Fire Brigade, and journalists from the local TV station El Tribuno and regional broadcasters, is covering every square foot of a densely wooded area where eyewitnesses claim having seen, less than 72 hours ago, the strange humanoid creature that has startled residents of the province's southern reaches. The Ucumar, as the citizenry has incorrectly christened it, would be a 2-meter-tall biped with a hairy body, large claws and ears, and fierce carnivorous habits. The true Ucumar, also known as the spectacled bear, is the only South American plantigrade, but it is herbivorous, easily frightened, and a resident of the tropical rainforests, measuring no more than 1.20 meters. There is no evidence that it exists in the country, although there are specimens in captivity in Bolivia and Ecuador. The operation combing the woods for this strange beast is under the command of Sheriff René Tecacho and José Ezequiel Alvarez, commander of the Volunteer Fire Brigade and of the Juan Carlos Rivas Archaeological and Paleontological Research Group. The expedition aimed at capturing the strange specimen began on Friday at 2100 hours, without police support, which was incorporated yesterday in the likelihood that the hominid may in fact be prowling the area. The fact is that the participants in the search, unarmed, heard strange howls and found prints that evidenced the recent transit of a heavy, 2-legged animal at around 1 o'clock in the morning. Miguel Moreno, a cameraman for a Rosario television station, said, "At one point, we heard the crackling of leaves and saw a silhouette which vanished quickly into the dense vegetation. Local dogs, a pack of over 30, began barking furiously. One of the hounds," he added, "went after the thing, and we heard it growl in the darkness, but then there was silence, and the dog was never seen again. The search area is located in the vicinity of the municipal garbage dump, 3 kilometers away from the center of the city, where there are trees, overgrown pastures, and all manner of shrubbery. We were unarmed and did not dare go deeper into the area for fear of an eventual misfortune resulting from an attack, said Jose Ezequiel Alvarez, who requested police support in order to continue. His request was granted yesterday when 20 elements from Rosario de la Frontera, reinforced by personnel from Regional Unit 3, headquartered in Mitan, joined the search. Pepo, one of the firefighters who participated in the first expedition, said, "I'm sure of having seen something resembling a large monkey, although the image was fleeting since it vanished quickly into the dense brush." At the close of this edition, members of the search team were getting ready to quit without having found the key to the door to this mystery, which has kept Rosario residents on tenterhooks after recurring accounts of encounters and sightings of the odd, hairy hominid. Article courtesy Alejandro J. Cordoba, A.R. Copyright Diario El Tribuno, Salta, Argentina. This is the end of story number 2. Story number 3. Bigfoot and Betty Allen, by Don Davis, copyright 2002. The headlines of the small November 1963 issue of the San Francisco Territorial News screamed, "Story behind the Bigfoot mystery, complete in this issue." Well, how could anyone resist buying that? Especially as it seemed you could unlock the mystery with only a 10-cent purchase. Of course, the fact that the November 1963 edition was on the newspaper rack in the spring of 1964 might discourage some from buying it. The paper didn't unlock the Bigfoot mystery for me, but it was perhaps the best dime I ever spent. It pointed me to the Presidio Branch Library in San Francisco, where an exhibit of Bluff Creek plaster tracks was on display. I had seen photographs prior to that time, but never casts. It also beckoned me irresistibly to the Fisherman's Wharf office of this newspaper, where they had a few copies of Betty Allen's Bigfoot Diary, hot off the press and available for 50 cents each. At that time, I was collecting anything I could find on Bigfoot and related creatures, so this Bigfoot Diary was a priority. Before I go on, please indulge me in a personal flashback. Late 1950s, I was living in New York City. An associate of mine told me one morning that he had seen a special on television the night before about a strange Yeti-like creature living in California. Since I was the only person he knew that had spent much time in California, he asked me if I had ever heard of it. At that time, I was firmly convinced of the existence of the Yeti in Asia, but had not yet heard mention of the name Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I assured him that any such thing was certainly impossible, but to his credit, I didn't convince him. The special had impressed him enough to leave him with an objective, open mind. I really can't defend the stand I took. In mitigation, perhaps it's to my credit that I did think about what he was saying for a few minutes, and then told him that I believe that the one place in California where such creatures could best exist, if they did exist, would be in the far northwest corner of the state. He said that he thought that was the very area that they were talking about. Around 1960, I moved to San Francisco Bay Area from New York. A year or two later, I came across Sanderson's Abominable Snowman book, which really began my education in cryptozoology. Thus, I was more than ready for and receptive to the November 63 edition of the SF Territorial News. The article in the Territorial News was an account of a visit to Willow Creek for their Bigfoot Days celebration by George Walmsley, publisher of the newspaper. The article included an account of a trip out along the Bluff Creek Road to see Bigfoot tracks. It wasn't long before I was at the newspaper's office on Fisherman's Wharf purchasing a Bigfoot diary and meeting George Walmsley. It turned out that Betty Allen was George Walmsley's aunt and the person that had arranged his Bluff Creek outing. During our conversation that day, I told him I was taking my family on vacation up the California coast and inquired about the possibility of viewing tracks. He encouraged me to contact his aunt and gave me her address in Willow Creek. Up to that time, I had hardly heard of Betty Allen. She is mentioned a couple of times in Sanderson's book, but so casually her name did not stick in my memory. I certainly wasn't aware of the extent of her investigations and her other efforts that were bringing such widespread attention to Bluff Creek. She was about as unknown to me then as she seems to be to many of the Bigfoot investigators and authors of today. I wrote to Betty. There was no reply for a while. Then, just a day or so before heading out, a letter arrived. It was dated July 17th, 1964, and said, in part, "I would be glad to meet with you, and though the news out of the area of Bluff Creek is very sketchy this year, I know earlier the tracks were seen. It would be a very interesting trip for you to take at any rate, and there is a fine camping spot at the Notice Creek Bridge. Workmen are going and coming, but with ordinary caution it is safe enough to drive. Loggers are very polite and careful in this area. I wish I had more recent news and more definite appearances this year, but often I do not hear when they come in, and the men are so busy they pay no attention." Now, Betty told me that at first she tried to discourage people from going to Bluff Creek or anywhere else to search for signs of Bigfoot. She was afraid they would find nothing and spread the word that it was all a hoax. Some insisted on poking around anyway, and in time she came to realize that those that went into the field to search often found nothing. She began encouraging those that wanted to investigate. She told me of 3 general areas that were good places to look for tracks. One was on Notice Creek. I forget if she mentioned the location of a second one, but the one she recommended to me was an area on Bluff Creek near Louse Camp. She didn't tell me where to look, but she did mention things to look for besides tracks. She also told me exactly, to the 10th of a mile, the best place to get down from the road into the steep-sided creek. Among the most interesting parts of my visit was hearing her relate much of the historical Bigfoot investigations and experiences. She talked a bit about searches for Bigfoot evidence, not only in the area of Bluff Creek, but, as she put it, coming in from the other side. Incidentally, it appears the term Bigfoot had been used in the Klamath area by non-Indians for some time before the creature ever made the Eureka newspapers. At the time of my first visit to Willow Creek, and for some time previously, Betty was a string reporter for the Eureka newspaper, gathering news and material from the areas near where she lived. The Yurok and Hoopa Indians had known for a very long time about the strange, hairy man-like giants that they called Oma, my own spelling from verbal coaching of a Yurok friend. Incidentally, it is a Yurok Indian that probably should get credit for the quoted reaction when first informed about the white man's interest in Bigfoot by replying that it was interesting that the white man had finally gotten around to discovering this. There are many accounts from loggers, female cooks at the logging camps, hunters, fishermen, ranchers, and other non-Indians in the area reporting sightings and tracks from long ago. I have seen and heard some of these accounts that go back at least as far as the early 1940s, and I have heard rumors of much earlier incidents. Betty told me about one very old Indian woman she took up to Bluff Creek to see the tracks. This woman carried the very old tattoos on her face that I understand were applied to young children of her tribe in the 1800s. The woman couldn't walk very far, and then only with help, When she saw the tracks, she excitedly exclaimed, "All my life I've heard about these things, and now at last I finally get to see their tracks." In the 1950s, logging operations in Northern California were going full blast. The one best known to Bigfoot buffs is one that was located in the Great V of the Klamath River, where a new road was built paralleling little-known Bluff Creek and stretching back more than 20 miles from the Klamath River. For much of the time that logging operations and road building were taking place near Bluff Creek and alongside the Lonesome Ridge, the workers camped out or lived in portable accommodations in the woods. They generally only went home on weekends, leaving their woodsy campsites deserted. It didn't take long before strange, large footprints started appearing, especially where new road gradings had taken place. Soon, other incidents began to occur, which have been previously mentioned in various Bigfoot records. Betty told me that the contractor was loath to have any word of these strange happenings reported to the outside world, partly for this reason, and partly not to be accused of being crazy. The workers were reluctant to speak of the strange events that were taking place. Some of the occurrences the workers found very alarming. At home on the weekends, some of the workers would confide their uneasiness to their wives, and in time, some of these wives began to talk to Betty. It is likely that Betty had heard about this Bigfoot creature prior to the time when these wives began to fear for their husband's safety. I do know that at some point Betty began her own investigation of whatever evidence she could uncover that might prove or disprove the existence of Bigfoot. Her efforts eventually convinced her that Bigfoot roamed her area, and his visits were not isolated or just occasional. The reports from workers' wives, coupled with information she obtained by other means, enabled Betty to gather a considerable amount of data. One time she was having dinner in one of the Willow Creek restaurants when she overheard a man at the table behind her talking about huge footprints. He had found these tracks around his snowbound construction equipment out in the woods. He was telling how he had followed the tracks for several miles in the snow, in the dead of winter, before turning back because of a new storm threat. She told me that when she overheard this conversation, she turned around and politely asked a question or two. This led to an evening's dinner where she spent about as much time conversing with the table behind her as with those at her own table. She said that on the restaurant wall near the table was a map of the Klamath area. And this map was used during this conversation to indicate various locations. Some years later, while having dinner in one of the Willow Creek restaurants, I noticed a map on the wall above my table. In looking closely at it, I noticed a circle and several other pencil marks drawn in the upper Bluff Creek area, and I wondered if these marks were added to that map one evening by a contractor and/or Betty Allen. I'm not sure that same restaurant is still there, but I do know the map has disappeared. With some of the information she gathered, Betty began a scrapbook. As the reports from loggers' wives and others accumulated, she began to try to interest her editor, Andrew Genzoli, in her material. She wanted to do an article for the Eureka paper. For some time, Mr. Genzoli expressed no interest in such an article. Finally, after repeated efforts on Betty's part, he stopped putting her off. Betty sent a small sample portion of her material. Then she waited for his response. Some days later, Betty opened the Eureka paper to see an article Mr. Genzoli had written using some of the material Betty had supplied. His article featured an illustrated cartoon caricature, probably so that no one would accuse the newspaper of seriously believing the Bigfoot material. Betty was disappointed. When she talked with her editor by phone, she learned that he fully expected hoots and ridicule to result from the article's appearance, but decided to publish it anyway. When letters from readers slowly began to arrive, Mr. Gonzalez was surprised that instead of ridicule, the writers told personal stories of Bigfoot experiences. Betty was surprised at the extent of the readership reaction. Later, Mr. Gonzalez got in touch with Jerry Crew regarding the cast that he had made and wrote a second article. It just might have been Betty Allen that brought Mr. Gonzalez and Jerry Crew together, as she was there helping Jerry Crew when he made his first cast. She said she came back the next day to the casting site with her own material and made a cast from the same series of tracks Jerry used. The article featuring Jerry Crew and his cast was the one picked up by the Associated Press wire service that resulted in changing the scope of Bigfoot investigations forever. Betty had not gotten to write her article, but her efforts to collect, examine, and her attempts to publish had launched the modern Bigfoot era. In Canada, John Green and René de Hinden read about the Bigfoot in Northern California, and first John and later René came to investigate. Tom Slick saw the reports and shifted his attention from the Yeti of Tibet to the Bigfoot of California. Now, Betty didn't seem to have great admiration for Tom Slick's Pacific Northwest expedition. She didn't approve of hunting Bigfoot with guns, especially since so little was known about it. She was relieved when the expedition members left without a Bigfoot specimen. It also may be that she declined to share her information with the Slick expedition. If this is so, it may explain why members of that group have pretty much ignored her contributions to the study of Bigfoot in their writings. In 1958, Ivan Sanderson became aware of reported Bigfoot activity in Northern California. In his book, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life, Sanderson, on page 129, makes the following statement referring to when he heard about California Bigfoot for the first time. The point I want to make is that this whole bit did sound quite absurd even to us, who became immune to such shocks years ago. It is all very well for abominable creatures to be pounding over snow-covered passes in Nepal and Tibet, but a wild man with a 17-inch foot and a 50-inch stride tromping around California was then a little too much to ask, even for us to stomach. In the foreword to his Abominable Snowman book, Mr. Sanderson also states, 3 years ago, his book was published in 1961, I dismissed all such evidence as either hoax or legend. Of course, that was before his trip to Willow Creek in 1959 and his meetings with Betty Allen. She said Sanderson stayed in a motel in Willow Creek for a week or two while she ran around lining up witness after witness for him to interview. She opened her files to him. She offered to accompany him to Bluff Creek, but he wasn't interested in viewing anything for himself, neither locations nor tracks. By the time Sanderson left, Betty had furnished him with enough material for a book on the Bigfoot of Northern California, which she expected him to write. Instead, he used only a small part, of her material for a chapter or so in his Abominable Snowman book. She was disappointed once again. It should be realized that the Bigfoot incidents in Bluff Creek in the 1950s and 60s were by no means unique. Similar happenings had been known in many places in and outside the United States. Sometimes the occurrences were, and still are, as frequent, if not more so, than Bluff Creek. But thanks to Betty Allen's efforts, it was Bluff Creek that got the big play in the newspapers, thus attracting the attention of many investigators and researchers and eventually Patterson and Gimlin. And Betty lived very modestly when I knew her. She did not even have a car. She enjoyed going out into the field to investigate, but to do this, she had to get someone to take her, as the trip from her home to the prime evidence areas was more than 50 miles over not the best of roads. Al Hodgson, who was later to be involved with the Patterson-Gimlin filming, and who now is doing such a nice job of developing the Bigfoot wing of the museum in Willow Creek, was one of those that accompanied her on trips up Bluff Creek. Today, Willow Creek seems to me to be about the same size as it was in the early 1960s. It is the southern gateway to Bluff Creek area and is the place where the Bigfoot Scenic Highway, State Highway 96, starts and proceeds north towards the creek Betty so loved to visit. The Willow Creek Museum is well worth a visit as it houses Bob Titmus's Bigfoot cast collection and other interesting material. It is a shame that Betty's material is not there as well. Willow Creek was Betty's hometown until the mid-1960s when she moved to Alaska. She wrote me sometime after the big Alaska earthquake, telling me of information she had received from Ivan Sanderson regarding Bigfoot happenings on the Pacific coast, near where Alaska and Canada meet. I think the idea of searching out Bigfoot in Alaska appealed to her. I was at the dedication of the Bigfoot wing of the Willow Creek Museum in 1999. I had been to the museum once before and have visited several times since. The staff of volunteers is very helpful and polite, but with the exception of Al Hodgson, none that I talked with seemed to have any idea who Betty Allen was. I think it would be nice if her name was on the outside of the museum in big letters, maybe something like the Betty Allen Bigfoot Museum and Research Center. What do you think? There is a copy of Betty Allen's small booklet, Bigfoot Diary, locked up in one of the museum's display cases. Outside of that, she seems pretty much forgotten in her hometown and most everywhere else. Don Davis was involved casually as a witness, investigator, and researcher in the field of cryptozoology since before Bernard Heuvelmans coined the term. The article appearing here is the first draft for a chapter of a book he was preparing about some of his more interesting Bigfoot experiences. Sadly, Don died in February 2002, and this article was his last work to see print. Copyright, published in Craig Heinzelman's Crypto, Hominology Special Number 2, 2002. This ends the third reading. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out there.